Good morning and welcome to our coverage of Anzac Day 2019 in Adelaide. Neil Cross with you. Alongside me, my ABC colleague Emma Rebelato and the RSL ambassador Bill Denny. And Emma, as we look forward to the march beginning soon, the focus this year shifts from the commemorative events that were covered in about World War I, and now we're looking forward to the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of hostilities in World War II.
And Neil, of course, World War I veterans are no longer with us. And Bill, as the years pass, we're seeing the number of World War II veterans dwindle as well.
That's right, Emma. We believe there's only just over 1,000 World War II veterans that survive in South Australia. We think that we'll see about 40 of them participating today, which means there's a sizable number at home, and I think we all want them to know that we're thinking of them, and today is very much about them, so they're in our thoughts.
Thanks for that, Bill. Well, our live coverage and our exclusive coverage will begin in about half an hour of the march, but right now let's go back to the beginning of the day and the dawn service at the National War Memorial on North Terrace.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention for the arrival of His Excellency, the Honourable Hugh Van Lay, AC, Governor of South Australia, and Mrs. Lay.
Yeah, you and Steve. Me, Jack. Yeah, and Jack. I know. There's like us three are the only young three fellas. And then the next closest is Stevie. Yeah, would be too. Would be. What's he doesn't really have that much of a budget. Normally shoots it himself. I mean, I could do this twice. Good to get your hand in there. Eventually.
Good morning, Your Excellency and Mrs. Lay, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. My name is Ian Smith. On behalf of the State President of the Return and Services League, I welcome you to this dawn service. Ninamani means hello, how are you, in the Kaurna language. On behalf of the RSL, I would like to acknowledge that this memorial is built on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We are reminded that, despite obstacles placed in their way for many years, Aboriginal men and women have stood shoulder to shoulder with their non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters in every war that Australia has fought since the Boer War, and we also acknowledge that there is more to do in recognising their service. 100 years ago today, commemorative ceremonies and services were held marking the 4th anniversary of the Gallipoli landing, the first since the armistice was signed. 1919 saw the signing of the Versailles Peace Agreement, which formally ended the First World War and sowed the seeds of the Second. In that year, Arthur Sullivan from Crystal Brook was awarded the Victoria Cross for fighting against the Bolsheviks in Russia, a long-forgotten war. By the end of 1919, hundreds of thousands of Australians had made the long journey home by ship, a large proportion of whom were wounded in body, mind and spirit. From a population of less than 5,330,000 Australians had served overseas, and 60,000 were buried in foreign soil or at sea. It is hard to imagine the sense of loss that would have pervaded every city, town and farm right across the country. This year marks the 75th anniversary of many Second World War battles and events, including the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the biggest naval battles in history, and the Battle of Surigao Strait. 1944 also saw the continued mistreatment, forced labour and starvation of Australian prisoners of war in Japanese hands, the Cowra breakout, D-Day and the strategic bombing of Germany, the end of the Huon Peninsula campaign and hard fighting during the Western New Guinea, Bougainville and New Britain campaigns. 2019 also marks the 50th anniversary of the battles of Hat Dik and Bin Ba during the Vietnam War. The Australian commitment to that war reached a peak of 8,300 in 1969. This year is also the 25th anniversary of the peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, whose members bore witness to the horrific genocide in that country, and it is the 20th anniversary of the largest ever Australian peacekeeping mission in East Timor that helped to bring peace and independence to one of our nearest neighbours. They are just two of over 100 peacekeeping and humanitarian missions Australians have served on during the last 72 years. Around 2,500 members of the Australian Defence Force are currently serving on operations, from border protection and peacekeeping to maritime security and train, advise and assist missions in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Last night, as part of the Anzac Eve Youth Vigil around this memorial, children from many different migrant backgrounds placed tributes, as they have for many years. That got me thinking about the contribution that recent migrants and their children have played in the defence of our nation. Many of you will know that around 30% of Australians were born overseas, and Australia's multicultural society is made up of migrants born in virtually every country around the world. On the badge of the RSL, alongside sprigs of wattle, are a leek, a rose, a thistle and a shamrock. But if you look at the rolls of honour inside this memorial and on the memorials around it, alongside names like Llewellyn, Brown, MacDonald and O'Connor, you will find names like Jurgens, Porigliano, Radke, Wiedenhofer, Radoslavich, Chastaneuf, Bergstrom, Pereira, Cesarowicz, Stasnowski, Boitano, Perez, Vandenbrink, Stanitsky, Lindqvist, De Vries van Leeuwen and Adamczyk all fell in Australian uniform while fighting for the country they called home. Despite the restrictions of the White Australia policy in the Defence Act, both the Chinese-Australian sniper Billy Singh and the Japanese-Australian scout Harry Koba Freem were enlisted, and both were awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, second only to the Victoria Cross, at Gallipoli. On the Western Front, the Danish-Australian Jørgen Jensen was awarded the Victoria Cross for his gallantry in the fighting for the Hindenburg Line in April 1917. In the Second World War, the Croatian-Australian Leslie Tomislav Starcevic was awarded the Victoria Cross for his gallantry in Borneo. The current president of the Royal Australian Regiment in South Australia, Mike von Berg, had to be hastily naturalised in Vietnam when it was discovered that he was actually a German citizen, not Australian, as he and the Army had assumed. The RSL State President, Bronson Horan, who was unable to be with us today, was wounded in Afghanistan just 6 months after becoming an Australian citizen. Recent migrants from many nations have a strong record of service in the Australian Armed Services that continues today. Some had already served Australia before coming here, such as the Afghan interpreters who are now proud South Australians. Today we remember the service and sacrifices of all Australians who have served our nation in wars and conflicts since Federation. In the last resort, they are the ones that we have relied upon to protect us, our way of life and our democratic freedoms. And we acknowledge the lessons they have taught us by their example, how to endure hardship and be courageous, to be daring as well as resilient, the importance of self-belief, and to unite when faced with adversity. Today we also acknowledge our allies, those that have stood shoulder to shoulder with us in both world wars and in many conflicts since, especially the people of New Zealand with whom we share a special bond forged on the rocky hills of Gallipoli, which continues to this day. Commander Steve Lennox of the Royal New Zealand Navy is here today to demonstrate that bond. We remember too the high cost paid by those we fought in those conflicts and recognise that the passing of time often leads us to reconcile our differences and embrace nations and people that were once our implacable enemies. Our close relationship with Turkey is a testament to that. Warfare is brutal, destructive and costly, an experience that often takes a severe toll from the civilian population, both in the war zone as well as at home, and of those who fight. It often leaves permanent marks on those who endure it, physically, mentally, morally and emotionally. Its only compensating attributes are courage in the face of death and the uniting force of comradeship. Today we will be joined later by the Victoria Cross recipient Keith Payne to remind us of that courage, and many men and women gathered here and elsewhere in Australia, New Zealand and across the world will be reminded of the bonds of mateship as they rekindle the spirit they experienced while serving. As we pause to remember and honour the fallen, we must also guard our Anzac traditions against unthinking nationalism, sometimes promoted by those who do not understand what Anzac Day is about. We must also be wary of those who seek to misuse the service and sacrifice of our men and women to promote their own narrow agendas. Such actions are unwelcome, and we must protect ourselves and our Anzac traditions from them. Likewise, Anzac Day has never been about success in battle. After all, our Anzac traditions spring from a costly disaster. Anzac Day has a single focus, the commemoration of Australian and New Zealand men and women who offered and often sacrificed their lives in our name. It is the time we acknowledge that we are commemorating a willingness to serve and sacrifice for our land and its people. This applies as much to our young people currently serving in the Middle East and elsewhere as it did to those that served in the First World War. It is also the time that we acknowledge that we have a duty as a society to support those who have lost loved ones to war and its aftermath, and to embrace our wounded veterans of all conflicts, some of whom are only just coming to terms with how their service has altered the path of their lives and those of their families. Sadly, this process can sometimes result in family breakdown and homelessness, and has seen many of our veterans take their own lives. So today we commemorate. We show respect, we honour and we give thanks. We remember the more than 102,000 young Australians who lost their lives defending our land, people and democratic way of life, and we remind ourselves to show compassion for those that have emerged from their service bearing physical, mental, moral or emotional scars. Finally, we remind those that we elect to represent us that they bear a great responsibility when they send our young people to fight on our behalf, a responsibility that includes ensuring they are treated with respect and cared for properly when they return home. I now introduce Chaplain Wayne Philp, who will lead us through our service of remembrance.
Please join with us in singing the hymn, O God, our help in ages past. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Our scripture reading this morning is taken from Jeremiah's book of Lamentations, chapter 3, starting at the 19th verse. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good that one should bear the yoke in their youth. To sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it, to put one's mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. To give one's cheek to the smiter and to be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, the Lord will have compassion, according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For the Lord does not willingly afflict or grieve the children of men. Let us pray in remembrance. Almighty God, gracious and merciful, abounding in steadfast love, we remember today the countless afflicted and the 40 million killed during the First World War, especially our Anzacs, who experienced in their wanderings the wormwood and the gall. They bore the yoke in their youth. They learnt well the pain of insults and the brutal hand of the smiter. They each, too many, put their mouth deep into the mud and gave up their life in the fields by foreign shores, in the Great War for peace. We remember the uncountable millions from all nations who were afflicted and killed in the Second World War and in the horrible regional and cultural wars fought long thereafter. Now, for 100 years, the cost of peace has been paid over and over again. Many Australians haven't made it home, but many have, to enjoy peace in their time. Yet others returned broken and morally wounded and still can find no peace. Almighty God, we pray for recent migrants to Australia, their children and their grandchildren, who have served and now serve in the Australian Defence Forces. we pray for all who work for peace. From every place and culture, people have come to this nation to make themselves for a better life, and in so doing make for us all a better world. Bless them, Lord. Bless us all. Help us all to seek and find you, that we may wait quietly for the fullness of your salvation. Have compassion, we pray, according to the abundance of your steadfast love. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness, O Lord. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite our senior guests to place a wreath or tribute on the memorial. The first wreath and tribute will be placed by His Excellency the Governor and Mrs. Lay. Mrs. Cheryl Cates, Acting State President of the Return and Services League, Commander Steve Lennock, representing the New Zealand High Commissioner, and Ms. Tanya Kaplan, representing the Turkish Association of South Australia. The Honourable Stephen Marshall MP, Premier of South Australia. Senator the Honourable David Fawcett, representing the Prime Minister. The Honourable Chris Karakis, Chief Justice of South Australia. The Honourable Peter Malinauskas, MP, State Leader of the Opposition. Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, representing the Federal Leader of the Opposition. The Right Honourable Sandy Verschoor, the Lord Mayor of Adelaide. Commander Andrew Burnett, representing the Royal Australian Navy, Brigadier Damien Cantwell, representing the Australian Army, and Air Commodore Philip Gordon, representing the Royal Australian Air Force.
Let us sing together, God of our fathers, known of old. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Squadron Leader Glenn Gallagher, the Deputy Air Base Executive Officer at RAAF Base Edinburgh, to recite the Ode of Remembrance. Squadron Leader Gallagher enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force in 1991 before being commissioned as an officer in 1998. He has deployed to the Middle East 3 times and was the first Australian instructor on the new P-8A Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft, one of which will be flying over the March today. After an overseas exchange posting, he returned to help the Air Force bring the Poseidon into service before moving to his current posting. After the ode, you are requested to remove non-military headdress and stand fast while the last post is sounded. The last post will be followed by 2-minute silence and the sounding of Reveille.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.
In the words of St. Paul to the Christian community at Corinth, "Finally, brothers and sisters, fare thee well. Mend your ways. Heed my appeal. Agree with one another. Live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All the saints greet you. And the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore."
We will now sing the national anthems of New Zealand and Australia.
So that was the dawn service from this morning at the National War Memorial on North Terrace. Moving as always, about 6,000 or 7,000 people there this morning were gathered, and gee, there's nothing like that minute or 2 minutes, as it is in this case, of silence. Just to bring everything to conclusion. Well, Neil Cross with you alongside Emma Rebellato and Bill Denny, the RSL SA Ambassador, and we'll be talking you through this march over the course of the next couple of hours. As you can see, the Greys are up the front of the march.
And Neil, after this march, we'll go to the service at the Cross of Sacrifice, and then at 12:30 we'll be crossing to Turkey for the Gallipoli dawn service. And an hour after that, it will be the dawn service from Villa Bretonneux in France. So we hope you can stay with us throughout the morning here on ABC TV, and then of course national coverage will continue after that throughout the day on the ABC News channel.
And here's a reminder also that the Adelaide March, and of course all the Anzac Day marches around the country in the capital cities that the ABC is covering, you'll be able to get them on ABC iView from later this afternoon. And if you'd like to find out how to purchase digital copies of the Anzac Day marches and the services, call our toll-free number there, 1300 650 587. Or you can use that email, progsales@abc.net.au. As we said, the Greys leading out the march. That is traditionally the way it happens in all major ceremonial activities in South Australia. The South Australian Mounted Police lead the way, and it commemorates the many members of the police who have served Australia in war, conflict and in peacekeeping roles.
And Bill, this is really the middle section of the trilogy of commemorations that we have here, isn't it? We started with the dawn service.
Yes, Emma, and then this is the march, the major commemorative activity for the state of South Australia, and it, I guess, replicates, or it's a metaphor for the procession from the church to the graveside, and the commemorative service, a service of remembrance at the Cross of Sacrifice afterwards is indeed the graves, is the third event, as you say, and it's the final of the trilogy. Yeah.
And what we'll be seeing throughout the march is a specific order. We'll be seeing the Navy first, then the Army, then the Air Force, and that's in order of seniority, isn't it, and also of formation.
It is exactly, core seniority, and by conflict. So we start off with acknowledging our early conflicts, and that of course is done through banners because there are no surviving veterans. But then we'll move on to World War II, where we do fortunately have surviving veterans, and then proceed right through. And within, as you say, within those groups, by service seniority, Navy, Army, Air Force, hopefully we'll have, we're never sure how many will come to this march until the day, but we're hopeful that 40 to 50 World War II veterans, but 950 at home watching, and we're there with us in spirit.
And Governor Hugh Van Lay, you can see him there on the dais, and he actually stands throughout this march.
He does. He acknowledges, takes a salute from all the participants.
As the police greys slowly make their way down King William Road, you can see the Royal Australian Navy Band behind them, and they're composed of members of the Navy Reserve based at the Keswick Barracks here in Adelaide.
So what will follow after that, the Returned and Services League flag party, and you can see there just the flags, and then the start of Group 1, the Boer War, World War I and legacy. The thing is about this, Bill, that we all know, and we've mentioned already, that we've gone past the centenary marks of the World War I events, and of course we don't have anybody surviving diggers from World War I, so these things will happen very quickly in the march. They will go through very, very quickly.
Absolutely. The very early part of the march is perhaps the hardest for everybody, hardest for people viewing because they go past so quickly, and hardest for us to give the appropriate acknowledgement to everybody, but that is the way it is. The first groups are basically, we acknowledge those that have served no longer with us through the banners and the various signs that acknowledge their service. You'll see very early on there,
right on the right of screen there, the New Zealand veterans who take very much a pride of place. They
Yes.
are part of Anzac. They are an intrinsic
Absolutely.
part of Anzac.
Yes, they call them the NZ in Anzac. They see themselves as the heart of Anzac. That's what they like to say. Very proud of that. And of course, they're we're very close to New Zealand, and none more than this year, given what's happened in Christchurch, for sure.
And you'll be seeing throughout the march as well medals that so many of these servicemen and women have been awarded. And the medals, they are worn on the left if they have served and were awarded the medals. And later on we'll be seeing the Descendants March, and they'll be wearing the medals on their right breast.
That's right, indeed. New Zealanders are our guests of honour on this day in Australia, and they traditionally lead the unit contingents. I just saw a quick flash of Silver, who was in the green beret. I see he's in a chair this year, but a regular and very popular marcher. There he is on the right-hand side of the front rank there.
So we can see members of the Turkish community there, and they have a really close affiliation with us because of the Gallipoli campaign.
Exactly, and this is the first time they've marched in this position, and we're so pleased to see them here. They're led by Tanya Kaplan, who's the president of the Turkish Association of South Australia, and we have a very close and wonderful relationship with this community. Forged at Gallipoli, interestingly forged at war, solidified, I guess, by the statement by Ataturk 19 years later, and people should take the time to read the Ataturk statement, of marvellous, generous words of healing and compassion directed to mothers that would never ever get to see their sons, nor where they were buried when they were lost at Gallipoli.
As we said, the banners coming through now from World War I. Boer War went through there, by the way. We were only a series of colonies at that stage, but 16,000 or over 16,000 Australian soldiers and another 16,000 horses went to South Africa to fight in the Boer War. There were 6 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians in that war.
Yes, that's right. 6 contingents went over there. 59 South Australians were killed, which is interesting comparing it with Vietnam, where we lost 58 South Australians. And William Westbury was a distinguished Aboriginal soldier from southeast South Australia, served in this conflict. The Boer War banners, they remind us, the World War I, banners remind us that 420,000 Australians served in World War I, and that was 37% of our male population at the time.
And we have Legacy as well, a non-profit charity which does such incredible work with the widows and families of war veterans.
Definitely. The presence of Legacy and their role reminds us of the true cost of war. It has such a tragic and enduring impact on families and communities, and the presence of the young children in that group reflect the passing of the more contemporary veterans, and the young children obviously have lost a parent at some stage as a consequence of war, and they're being cared for by Legacy. They do such a marvellous job.
Whilst we have no diggers surviving from World War I, we have 4 widows of World War I veterans that are under Legacy's care in South Australia, and the eldest widow is 107.
Exactly.
Incredible.
Now we move on to Group 2, so in service seniority, this is the Naval Veterans of the Royal Navy, Royal Australian and Royal Navy, and the Merchant Navy Veterans, and this is the first of World War II. And here comes our flyover, the Tiger Moth flyover. These men would have come up from Aldinga. How many have we got? 4? 2? 4. They would have come up from Aldinga this morning. They would have left Hindmarsh Island last night and staged at Aldinga overnight. And those men, they're all RAAF aircraft, original aircraft, and we thank Barry Hills, Daniel Pless, Steve Johnson and Tim Brownbridge for piloting those aircraft, their own aircraft today.
So there we have the merchant cruisers.
And I can see Ron George there. Ron, a prominent World War II veteran who on the Westralia when it was attacked by a kamikaze aircraft, and also became a coxswain and served in landings in the Philippines and other areas of the Pacific.
As the Tiger Moths fly over, we just saw HMA Sydney 2 as well, and that was first celebrated for many successful battles, but then encountered the German raider Cormoran. and that was regarded as Australia's greatest naval tragedy.
And here come those tiger moths for the
Straight down King William Street.
straight down King William Street. They're always hopeful there won't be a headwind, or they could be static over the parade for a serious period of time. I'd like to mention Brian Lay here. He's not marching today, and the HMAS Hobart just went past. Brian's at home in Myrtle Bank, but he served on the Hobart and was on board when it was attacked by torpedo by the Japanese in 1943, and was trapped in this transmitting room on his own well below water level for 12 hours overnight in the dark. And I can't think of a much more frightening experience than that. So good on you, Brian.
Absolutely. And to survive that, extraordinary.
Yeah. And now on to N-class destroyers, the Nizam, Napier, Nestor, Norman and Nepal. And they were built for and owned by the Royal Navy, but they were manned by RAN crews, and therefore they had the prefix HMAS. They played a prominent role in taking supplies and troops on the Tobruk ferry or the Spud Run, and evacuating wounded troops and prisoners during the siege of Tobruk.
And now we have some military vehicles taking some of our veterans who can't march but still really want to take part. And this is such an important way of them to do that, isn't it?
Yes, and in those vehicles a special mention to Warwick Rowe and Keith Dunbar, who have been carried in that great Jeep signed Corvettes. Warwick turns 100 tomorrow on the 26th of April. He served for 2.5 years as a crew member on the Corvette HMAS Castlemaine as a supply assistant. Keith is a youthful 94, and he served as a stoker on HMAS Bungaree and HMAS Torrens. We hope you have a great day, boys.
So now we have the Royal Australian Navy communicators. And these were the men that were relied on to keep all of the units of all the different fleets informed of the movements of each other's ships. And they relayed coded instructions both from the mainland and also from ship to ship. So a very important role.
They did. It was very important indeed. I'd like to mention Roy Mingy, who was in the group that just went past. Roy joined the Bathurst, one of the corvettes in Bombay, in 1944, age 17, and went on to serve on other ships. But what's interesting, Roy's brother Ron is marching today with the 2nd 6th Cav Commando Regiment, and at 93 and 95 respectively, they're wondering whether they're the oldest brothers to have survived from World War II.
We just saw their HMAS Warramunga, and that sailed more than 500,000 miles during her commissions in World War II and Korea.
Yes, the tribal class destroyers. Arunta, Warramunga and Bataan. So now we're coming into Group 3. They're passing very, very quickly. So this is the Army veterans. In 2018, 21 World War II veterans marched in this group, and I'm sure how many we'll have today.
And they started with the Australian Women's Army Service.
Yep.
And about 3,000 South Australian women enlisted and were part of the 35,000 strong Army women Australia-wide.
Absolutely, and they saw service in New Guinea and Australia as drivers, signallers, clerks, cooks and as training staff.
It built a bit of a focus to acknowledge the number of women that were in the armed forces.
Absolutely, and it's been an understated role, and it's important that is now being acknowledged. And there are Tiger Moths on their return trip.
You certainly get a good chance to have a good look at them, because they're not moving at the speed of light, that's for sure.
And now we have the Z Special Unit,
Yes.
the Cavalry Squadrons as well, and the M and Z Special Units combined.
The Z Special Unit, I see Merv Fox is there marching. He served with the 2nd 14th Battalion in Victoria, but transferred to Z Special Unit and served in Darwin. And we fondly remember Jack Treadray, who was a regular marcher, and indeed I'm privileged to be wearing Jack's tie today. Many recall Jack's red beret and his splendid military bearing. We lost him last year. He was a truly brave man, and in 45 his service involved parachuting to the Japanese-occupied Sarawak and working closely with the Kelabit and Iban people. Jack's eldest grandson Gary is marching today and is wearing his medals. Good on you, Gary. And your grandpa, a great man.
And again, this is a reminder, dwindling numbers of World War II veterans. We're obviously 80 years since the outbreak of hostilities in World War II, and it's another reminder when you see people marching like this and you just realise how many men have gone and how many women have gone that have served our country.
Yeah.
Bill, it's also a mark of what the RSL's tried to do in South Australia, and that is to separate the veterans from those who are relatives or that
the
haven't
next of
served.
kin. Yeah, that fortunately the people that the families respect that now. Just that Group 3 vehicle, Neil, there's that minibus has the ladies from 58 Searchlight Battery. Lady Downer was a prominent member of that unit, but we've got there today Norma Cotton, Dulcie Freeman, Elaine Heath, Dawn Hurst, Di Watson and Joan White. So well done, ladies. They're waving to us. That's nice. 6 Army Troops Company and Australian Water Transport after them.
Australian Water Transport, interesting. The function was to supply and reinforce forward areas in the Southwest Pacific area of operations, which were serviceable only by sea.
Yes, yes, indeed. There's an interesting story that when the Japanese were coming through the north of Australia and using their own water transport, they had no time for the indigenous people, the countries they were occupying, and indeed sometimes the treatment was unfortunate, whereas the Japanese struggled with the reefs and on all the waterways up there, whereas the Australians embraced the indigenous people and they became pilots for their small ships and were able to be eminently more successful by doing that.
And they really did play such an important role in all our wars.
And once again understated, as you talked about the women earlier on, Neil, the part the indigenous troops played is very much understated as well.
Bill, what happens? We're seeing fewer veterans, obviously, as we've talked about, march in these groups. What happens to their signs if there are no men or women marching behind?
Well, you don't, unfortunately, you don't know until we let them march for 3 years. And if no one turns up for 3 years, then that's when we retire the sign. So you will see for 3 years, you may see a sign with no one behind it, but at that time we then know that that there's not likely to be anybody marching again. So the sign is retired and it marches at the rear of the rear of the group.
And
so
that's what we're seeing there, the 2nd
right.
1st Machine Gun Battalion.
A tough ask because they 2nd, 1st, and a number of the battalions had this issue where they regrouped in Egypt and returned to Australia to undergo jungle training. So
yes.
that was the events of what happened in World War II. With the threat initially was across in Europe and North Africa, and then it became the Japanese in the Pacific.
Precisely. That's exactly what happened. And they're fighting in 2 different theatres, and some of those units did amazing work.
Well, I have to say it is an absolutely perfect day weather-wise in Adelaide this morning. The sun is shining. It's still fairly cool, which I suppose would actually help more veterans walk and take part in this march, and lots of people out as well showing their respects.
You'll see a unit coming up now, 2nd, 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, and very prominent, was led by Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Blackburn, VC, a highly respected World War I veteran. But you'll see 3 veterans marching, I hope, today. I can see Bluey Stevens on the right of the screen, sitting holding the sign in his uniform. And I think we should have dear Jack Thomas and Keith Fowler. Now, all those men were prisoners of war. Bluey Stevens was a labourer on the Burma-Thai Railway, a slave labourer, and he worked in the coal mines under the Sea of Japan. Now, Bluey turns 100. There he is in August. He's being pushed by his granddaughter, Iniki. Jack Thomas, I hope, is there, but if not, I can't quite see yet. But Jack is a Broken Hill boy. He laboured on the Burma-Thai Railway before enduring a perilous sea journey to Japan, where he worked in coal mines, sometimes labouring barefoot in water up to his knees. Jack always said that he owed a lot to the Welsh miners, because when they were working in the coal mines under the Sea of Japan, the Welsh miners were the ones that knew when there was going to be a mine collapse and would tell the Australians so they could scurry out. And then there's Keith Chook Fowler, who should be there with the 2nd, 3rd. There we are, That's Keith right behind the sign there with his hand up, the grey-haired gentleman, dear Keith. And he spent 3.5 years on the railway, very lucky to survive an encounter with a Japanese guard, and exceptionally pleased to see him because he had a fall recently. Look at him, there we are, 98 years old.
98 and marching pretty proudly too.
Yeah. So those 3 men, there's only 6 prisoners of war, as I think, I could stand to be corrected there, surviving in South Australia. 3 come from the one unit. And of course, when we see them, we remember other members of their unit, Bill Schmidt and Ron Gratz, and the families of the members of that unit still get together and have a lunch every month, which is lovely.
It's interesting too, you'll notice that there was a bit of gap between some of these marches, and Bill, that's just simply because obviously age means that they slow down, and they're also, though, asked quite deliberately to march at a different pace to some of those who will come through who are obviously still serving at the moment.
It's a great challenge. When I was chairman of the Anzac Day Committee, there we are, Keith Payne is there, Keith sitting on the dais, and Keith is our last surviving recipient of the Imperial Victoria Cross. The Victoria Crosses to contemporary veterans are Australian Victoria Crosses. This is the Imperial. Keith served in the Vietnam War. He was in working with the Vietnamese in the training team, and in May 1969, when he was serving with a mobile strike force battalion, they were attacked by a large force of North Vietnamese. His troops, Keith's troops, fell back under attack, but Keith then stayed and spent 3 hours scouring the battlefield for his men. He found 40, and for that bravery he was awarded the Victoria Cross. In the screen now on the left with the white cane is Jack Thomas. So the 3 boys have marched, Blue, Jack and Keith.
Yeah, and Bill, I was talking before that about the gaps will form because simply, obviously, some of these men at their age, they can't keep up the pace, but they are asked to walk or march at a different pace to obviously the soldier. These
men are nearly 100, and look at them. You know, they're just so inspirational. They really are. Look at them.
And some of them train specifically for this, don't they?
They do. You can tell. It's getting a bit hard. Keith had a tumble in his home recently and broke some ribs only 4 or 5 weeks ago. You know, these
determined to be here.
They are determined, and they do it for us. These, particularly Jack Thomas, he didn't want to. He thought, well, I'm not well enough, and then he reflected that he's doing it for the other 797 members of his unit who have passed. He's doing it for the families, them and their families, and he's doing it for us and the young people that are here today, so that they can just learn a little bit about what was done in their name.
So we saw the South Australian Police Band, and now we have the 2nd 27th Battalion. And this was formed at Woodside in May 1940. It served a short time in the Middle East before service on the Kokoda track.
I'm not sure if 2nd 10th went past. It should have been in front of the 2nd. Oh, there it is. There's a sign there behind the 7th Division. No marchers today, but I can see Peter Collins carrying the banner. There is one marcher. Now, I don't know that gentleman, but I do know that Murray Willing, who would normally be marching, 99 years old, from Ardrossan. Murray, you had a bit of a fall recently and couldn't make it, but we're thinking of you, and we miss you.
Now we're moving on to Group 4, Army veterans from World War II.
Before we get to that, Emma, if I could just mention Ed Ebsery, who's watching from Port Broughton. He'll turn 100 on the 15th of October, but he served, as you said, Neil, he served with the 2nd 27th in Syria and Lebanon before he went onto the Kokoda track, where he was wounded twice. He recovered, was commissioned, and finished the war in the campaign in Bougainville in the North Solomon Islands, and a true legend of the Blythe area, spending his full 99 years in that area, and he'll be watching today. Good on you, Ed.
Well, so many of these marches have so many stories that we just actually are incapable of understanding and imagining.
That's right.
What they went through, what they survived, what they continued to do.
The 2nd, it's all very rushed now, but the 2nd 7th Field Regiment has come through, and they came from Woodside and were equipped for service in the Western Desert, Syria and Lebanon. And John Bernard Norman was a prominent member of that unit. We acknowledge his service. I think Philip Young is marching today too with his granddaughter. And then we have the 2nd 43rd and the 2nd 43rd and 2nd 48th Battalion.
And the 2nd 48th was actually the most highly decorated unit in the 2nd AIF. It was formed at Wayville in July 1940.
This is 9 Div Army Service Corps there, and they were responsible for supply, transport and foodstuffs for the transport for troops in the front and rear lines. I see that Sandy Hill there with the grey hair sitting in the middle, and a prominent member of the Gore RSL, 98 years of age. And we remember Captain John Osmond, who was a member of this unit. He served his nation, and like far too many, he died not long after the war.
And now we have interstate units, and this association was formed in 1955 for ex-servicemen based in South Australia who served in interstate units in Australia and overseas.
Just in front of that interstate unit is the 27th SA Scottish Regiment. That's Les Brown in the chair on the left in the front of the screen there, and Les is one of the last. I think there's 2 members surviving, and Les turned 18 in uniform, and he's the gentleman I think I mentioned last year who's kept a diary for every day of his life. What a marvellous task. That'd be an interesting read, Emma, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. It'd be a big read, I'm guessing.
Clive Witchow, a prominent member of the Port Noarlunga community, was a member of that unit, but Clive passed some years ago.
So that's followed by the parachute battalions.
Back to these parachute battalions. Gordon McLeod used to march every year in the parachute battalions, but he's sadly, he passed away. We had one parachute battalion which was formed in 43, formed from volunteers from all the units that returned from other campaigns overseas.
Moving on now through the Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers.
Yes, and indeed, the man on screen there was Laurie Gillespie, marching. He was a sergeant in Ordnance Corps, and he saw service in Darwin and Port Moresby and Lae. Pushed, well, he was going to be pushed, but he's accompanied by his grandson Nick. That's good. Good to see Laurie there.
Australian Women's Land Army coming through there. Now, the Land Army was formed to take over things like rural production and release men for service in the armed forces during World War II.
These women farmed the land and supplied agricultural product during most of the war years, and Sadie Valadez was leading that unit in the chair. She's being pushed by great-grandson Sean, but Sadie joined the Women's Land Army at 17 and worked in Market Gardens, Seaton, Paradise, Waikerie and Berry.
And now we go on to the Royal Air Force veterans.
Group 5, Navy, Army, Air Force, and we have the group being led by Robert Black, but all these lovely ladies, the ladies that served in the Women's Australian Auxiliary Air Force, Betty Plummer, June Hunter and Ray Harris are there. Betty Plummer at the rear on the left was teleprinter operator in General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. We'll move straight on to Southwest Pacific area.
And the flying boats and Hudsons, and they're marching with the Hudson squadrons.
Very, very quickly, they pass.
Yeah, a lot of banners there and that, but not a lot of marches.
No, that's exactly right. I'd like to acknowledge Flying Officer Edward Mosby. I do that because he was a talented B-25 bomber pilot, and in World War II he served with the United States Air Force as a RAAF officer, but he was killed in action in 1942, but his bravery was only recognised in 2014 when he was awarded posthumously the American Silver Star, and his family are very proud of that. Up
there, the Kensington and Norwood Brass Band, established way back in 1868.
Yeah. That's right.
And the band is followed by Southeast Asia. We also have Middle East and the 458 Squadron, RAAF, formed at Williamstown in New South Wales in 1941.
The RAF and the RAAF, United Kingdom. So airmen who served in the UK, not only in Australian squadrons.
See Doug Leake being congratulated. Somebody's come from the crowd there to congratulate him. Doug served with 452 Squadron as a Spitfire pilot.
They do go through quickly, don't they? 452 Squadron, as you mentioned, 456 Squadron of the RAAF.
I correct myself, it was Doug Hoyle that was the pilot in 452.
We get through the transport vehicles. You see how much the veterans enjoy getting the old Jeeps and that RAAF car coming through afterwards. Have a look at that.
Yes, it's interesting that Bomber Command veterans used to march, and Bomber Command was such an important part of World War II, but I didn't see any this year, and it looks like the number of them are consigned to have decided to go in vehicles, and we've got Don Looker in Bomber Command Jeep that's at the front of the screen there. He was an operator, wireless operator gunner with the RAAF and completed 32 missions. Travelling in the Chevrolet there is Fred Brown. He was an upper gunner in Lancasters and flew with 514 Squadron. He was shot down over Belgium, and after some time evading the enemy, he's in that vehicle there, he was captured and spent much time as a prisoner of war in Poland until the end of the war.
And now we have quite a number of vehicles transporting our marchers, so they can take part in this very important day.
Yes, and I'd like to acknowledge Curly King, who would normally be in one of these buses, but Curly passed very recently. He served with 2 Squadron RAAF in Vietnam, and he was a long-term resident of the Julia Farr Centre at 29 years, and certainly one of the most courageous men. The way he accepted that challenge that I've ever seen, and our thoughts are with his family, and as especially the caring staff of Julia Farr. Rory Centofanti is Curly's mate. He'll be in one of the buses as well.
It's a great way. It still happens for them, doesn't it? The veterans, they love it. They're in some ways hidden behind the smoke glass and that, but they still love being part of this day. Well,
indeed, that bus there has got the RSL Care banner on it. There's 2 RSL Care banners, and these are the men that are now in care at the RSL Villas at Angle Park or up at Myrtle Bank at the War Veterans Home. And you've got men there waving, Stanley Bailey and Robert Richardson and Lion Skinner and indeed Alan Tregenza, who are all World War II, and then Pacific or the Europe, Murray McIntosh from Vietnam, and then also Jeff Wilshire, Stanley Bilborough and Ernest Martin from Vietnam. But it's their march, and it's important that we try and find out who's in those buses and give them a bit of a cheerio.
2019 also marks the year of the epic flight centenary. So the History Trust of South Australia will coordinate a series of events to celebrate the achievement of Sir Ross and Sir Keith Smith. Ross Smith enlisted in August 1914, joining the 3rd Light Horse Brigade, served in the Dardanelles and later in Romani. And in 1919, after World War I had come to an end, the then Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, offered £10,000 for the first Australian airman to fly home from England in 30 days. 6 crews took up the challenge.
Well, that's right, and the South Australian brothers Ross and Keith Smith were backed up by mechanics Wally Shears and Jim Bennett, and they were one of the teams of challengers. Ross flew as the pilot, Keith as assistant pilot, and they left England on November 12, 1919, and they finished in Darwin on December 10, 1919. And they won the event, and only one of the 5 other groups that took up the challenge actually made it to Australia, and the Smith brothers were both knighted for their efforts.
We're up to Group 6 now. Which,
Yes, they're going through very, very quickly, aren't they?
So we had Beekoff, Korea, Malaya and Borneo.
Yes, Naval Association are leading here, and their president, Corbin Dingle and Maddie St John, who Women's Royal Australian Naval Service.
and again, the RSL took up the cause, if you like, of acknowledging the women who have served Australia in the last couple of years.
Yes, it's very important to us that the recognition is balanced. Those ladies in the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service have rendered exceptional service in all different sorts of shore duty functions, freeing men for active service at sea. Several hundred became communicators working in shore telegraph stations.
And we have the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps.
Yes, that corps was formed in 1951, and in World War II there were 3,477 joined the Australian Army Nursing Service. 71 died, 23 in conflict. But they've gone on to serve in pretty well every conflict since then.
It's the second of our flyovers for the day. This is a boomerang.
And this represents World War II era.
You can see the difference there. The earlier flyover
Absolutely.
of the Tiger Moths took forever, but the cameramen have to catch up with the boomerang.
They do.
So the boomerang was the first Australian-built single-seat fighter, and it was built between 1942 and 1945, with, of course, the threat of the Japanese in mind.
That's right, that's right.
Those fighters were based in Australia, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands and Borneo, and they were replaced by the Kitty Hawks and the Spitfires. Coming up to veterans from the Malaya and Borneo.
So the first was the Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960. 7,000 Australians served there. And the second was known as the Indonesian confrontation. And that took place between 1962 and 1966. And it's so important that they are recognised because at the time very little was known about the Indonesian confrontation because there was so little media coverage because of the sensitivity of cross-border operations.
Absolutely. Yes, like the Korean War, the veterans of the Malaya-Borneo conflict often don't get the recognition they're due. They do now through the hard work of their association led by Brian Selby. Marching with the Malaya-Borneo veterans was Army nurse Captain Aileen Ryan, who served in the Indonesian confrontation. There you can see Brian leading his group there, and they're a good bunch. They've got a significant reunion in Sarawak, in Kuching, later this year. We wish them well for that.
Should be pointed out too that the Malaya and Borneo missions were ultimately successful with no territory lost.
Absolutely, yes. It was a significant, yes, it was, as we say, a lesser known conflict, but Australia served exceptionally well. The men that served there served in the same tradition as all their those that have gone before them and served subsequently.
And this is the Onkaparinga City Concert Band, and they perform right across the metropolitan area.
That's right. When we then go into the Far East Strategic Reserve, that was a joint military force of British, Australian and New Zealanders formed to protect common interests in the Southeast Asia region from internal and external communist threat. There were 26 ships of the RAF and 5,000 soldiers served in the FESR, and indeed Eugene Chaplin, who's the father of the Chief Marshal, Tony Chaplin, served on HMAS Melbourne as part of the Far East Strategic Reserve. We lost Eugene last year, but he was a great contributor and was missed by us all.
And we start to see, if you like, the slow build-up of veterans now, Bill, where as we said, nobody from Boer War and World War I and some of these other campaigns, the numbers are smaller, but now we start to see the build-up to more recent.
Contemporary, yes.
Yeah.
We're starting with the Royal Australian Navy, once again, that service seniority. Royal Australian Navy Vietnam, and they were there between 1962 and 73 and did everything from logistic and support ships through to Navy helicopter pilots, and one of those is Anthony Casadillo of Mount Gambier, who was killed in Vietnam, and a well-known South Australian. And we lead on to the RAN destroyers who served in Vietnam, attached to the 7th Fleet. They were known as the gunline destroyers, and they, from offshore, delivered gunfire support to the ground forces, and you can see them coming up now with their banner.
And then you can see the clearance divers, extremely dangerous job, one of the most demanding and prestigious roles in the Navy.
Absolutely. There was a chap I met called Ken Hainitz, who's the father of TV personality Erica Hainitz. Ken served in that unit and was a very brave man, survived the war, but as an avid sailor decided to sail to England on his own and disappeared off the coast of Madagascar in 1998, which was sad.
And this is the Scotch College Adelaide Pipe Band.
We also have the training team there, very few marching behind that now, one of our most elite unit, one of our most consisting of highly experienced officers and senior NCOs who acted as military advisors to the South Vietnamese. We've talked about Keith Payne being a member of that, but also Brigadier Pat Beale from South Australia, one of our most decorated veterans.
And we have the Royal Australian Armoured Corps.
Moving on to the Armoured Corps.
And you can see their flags are lowered there. And that's to honour 5 South Australian diggers from 3rd Cavalry Regiment who were killed in action in South Vietnam.
Now, I want to mention Craig Mitchell was a prominent South Australian, a national serviceman who was commissioned into this corps. He served with these men. I don't think Craig's marching, but he did 2 years in Vietnam. And the 2nd year was as a troop commander, and he was exposed to an extraordinary amount of enemy action, in fact blown up 5 times. He was so lucky that when he left, we held a party to celebrate his survival when he left Vietnam.
Wow.
He went on to become a very successful physiotherapist after the war. We go to artillery, and this group represents the artillery batteries that supported the infantry units operating out of the Australian Task Force base at Phuoc Tuy in Vietnam. Represent 12 Regiment, 1 Regiment and 4 Regiment.
Royal Australian Engineers next, which includes the Tunnel Rats, marching as engineers but in their own group.
Absolutely. You've got the engineers first, and Terry's Ager, we send you our best mate, and Roger Cook, who are marchers, or Terry's not, but Roger might be there. But I think the Tunnel Rats, which are coming up now, this is a special group led by John Hosking, and Tony Parmenter's there. This is the first time they've marched behind their own banner. This is an engineer unit. These men faced an extraordinarily challenging battle space and were probably some of the, well, they were some of the bravest, not probably, they were some of the bravest in Vietnam. These are the men you note there. You might have noted the emblem on their banner, which is the rat with a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. Well, that's effectively what they had when they went into the tunnels. They were scantily dressed because of the heat, and down they went. And it's such a challenging thing to do. They're marching for the first time on their own, and they deserve every recognition.
So their casualties were very high, so averaging 33% for the duration of the war. So the fact that there are even men marching is really quite a testament to their
Yes.
abilities to survive.
I think crawling down a tunnel in the dark, not knowing what you're going to encounter, would be strengthen your resolve.
That was followed by the Royal Australian Corps of Signals.
Yes, they were in Saigon, Vung Tau and Nui Dat, and they maintained the communication flow that was so essential to keep everybody informed in the battle space. In 161 reconnaissance flight, wearing the powder blue berets, you can see them there. They flew small fixed-wing aircraft and Sioux helicopters in Vietnam. They also flew, it was an army unit with army pilots and ground staff, but they operated directly in support of infantry units in the field. They observed the battle from the air and conducted reconnaissance and directed artillery support. Nobody behind intelligence this year. Yes, one gentleman. Intelligence Corps was been represented in all our major conflicts, and they acquire and provide all the intelligence needed in the battle space. Then RAASC, Service Corps men, that provide all the road supply and road transport support to troops in the field, led by Dean Ryan and Tony French. Then we go on to Army Ordnance Corps. 86 Transport Platoon was there earlier on, but they're having a reunion interstate today. So there are very few of them marching, but we'd like to remember Nugget Whalen, Johnny Jebb and Gary Wolford. Also Rocky Anok watching, who comes into, who turns 90 tomorrow. Good on you, Rocky. Also, he was a veteran of the Battle of Kapiong in Vietnam, in Korea.
So the first Australian field hospital we saw there, and their motif, the bat or the vampire.
Yes, they formed in South Vietnam in 1968, taking over from 8th Field Ambulance, which followed them, in fact, in the march. They provided all that essential surgical, medical and dental services that you need.
And there's the 8th Field Ambulance.
Yes, Rod Murray marching there, right marker. I'll get in early after these vehicles, important vehicles. The first with South Vietnamese veterans in it. But we then have the Royal Australian Electrical Mechanical Engineers. I just want to mention Frank Owen, who was the led this group, very prominent member, was a former state vice president of the RSL, and he passed this last year, and we miss him dreadfully.
So that's after the transport vehicle. So a little bit to the left of screen there, down the road, you'll see the Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers.
That's right.
So that's the group there.
That's the group, yeah.
And their role was to fix and repair pretty much everything, equipment, weapons, tanks, they did the lot.
Yes, you can imagine the amount of work that's needed to keep an Army, Navy, and, well, in this case, the Army, running all those vehicles you can see in front of you. Everything from a rifle to a radio needed to be repaired. And in the field, the treatment that sort of equipment is exposed to is pretty severe, so these men had their work cut out for them.
Just behind them, the Vietnam Veterans Organisation. So this is a combination of the Vietnam Veterans Association SA branch and the Vietnam Veterans Federation SA branch.
Yes, they're all there. They've marched together, which is a great idea. I can see Robin Carbon's there, who is from 3RAR. He represents the VVF, but there's also Bob Shahinga there and Phil Scroop, those men that do so much hard work for their colleagues and other members of the veteran community.
And they're followed by the Citizen Military Force observers. And they were sent over for short bursts for about 2 weeks. About 700 officers participated, including 42 South Australians. They volunteered for duty to observe the regular army operations in the war zone.
And one was killed and 9 were wounded in that period, but they were able to bring back valuable knowledge they can impart to their CMF, or we call it now Army Reserve, or Army Reserve colleagues.
Bill, you never know how long the march is going to be, but on a perfect day like today, I imagine there'll be a lot more veterans who are on the edge of deciding whether they might march or not. They'd certainly be here today.
Well, that definitely applies to the World War II veterans, Neil, because weather can be such a deciding factor, but no doubt it does help. But as we said, we never know how many are going to be here until the day, so it's like you can make the most elaborate preparations, and the Anzac Day Committee do that, but it's like a party. You never know whether anybody's going to turn up until the last minute. We always know lots of people are going to turn up, but just where and when is a difficult thing.
So this is the Glenelg, as you just saw, the Glenelg Brass City of Holdfast Bay Concert and Port Adelaide City Bands. And that should be followed by the Royal Australian Air Force Vietnam. These gentlemen flew Iroquois, they flew helicopters and also bombers and cargo aircraft. They flew the Iroquois troop and insertion and resupply helicopters. They also used Iroquois as bush ranger attack helicopters. They flew Caribou and Hercules transport aircraft, as well as the Canberra bombers from 2 Squadron in Phan Rang. I'd like to mention Dennis Stinson, who served for 22 years as an engine fitter. He ended up working with 2 Squadron, and he's probably very well known because he's the father of Wayne Stinson, who does so much good work in Department of Veterans Affairs for all of us. And then we had their RAAF U-bomb. That's an interesting, now U-bomb's in Thailand, but the men that flew out of that supported the war effort in Vietnam, so that was little known. So they indeed have been awarded a medal for their service in support of the Vietnam War. And this is HMA Submarines, and they conducted surveillance missions in waters off Southeast Asia during the Cold War era.
So a lot of these groups that are coming through, Bill, in some ways, they're almost forgotten that these men took part in these things that happened. You know, the major wars are there, but you forget that there are all these other peacekeeping forces, but also other areas that Australian men and women have served.
There's a huge number, and indeed I've got some statistics which we might dwell upon a bit later on. How many when you add the humanitarian peacekeeping operations, it's well over 150, I think. Here's the Australian Entertainment Group. We saw there Johnny Mack and Bev Harrell, who are regular marchers. They're just going out of screen now. And then we come to our Vietnamese veterans, who are led by Din, Mr. Day Din Ninh. These marvellous men, post-1975, were some of them incarcerated very long periods of time, being the defeated South Vietnamese. I know Din did 13 years in a re-education camp, but when they got out, most of them got their families and took the leaky boats and came to Australia as soon as they got the chance, and they've made a marvellous and exceptional contribution since being here. And of course our governor is not a veteran, but certainly took that leaky boat and is loved by us all, Hugh Van Lay. They're a great community.
We're under Group 9, the Royal Australian Regiment. And Special Air Service Regiment veterans.
We saw there the 1st Battalion as well. A very strong link back through time, formed in 1948. And the 2nd Battalion on screen, operational roles including Korea, the Malayan Emergency, Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Indeed. And peacekeeping and humanitarian roles in Somalia, Rwanda, East Timor and Solomon Islands. Followed by the 3rd Battalion.
City of Onkaparinga Pipe Band was just going through there too.
3rd Battalion was formed from the 67th Battalion in 1948. Served in Korea and in Malaya and Indonesia and Vietnam and Afghanistan, and peacemaking in East Timor and the Solomon Islands.
So just a reminder that at 12:30 we'll be crossing to Turkey for the Gallipoli dawn service. and that'll be followed at 1:30 by the dawn service from Villa-Bretonneux in France. So that'll be straight after our coverage of Anzac Day here, which will include the march, of course, and the Cross of Sacrifice afterwards.
And these are members of the 4th Battalion, raised in Woodside in February of 1964, specifically for Vietnam. And operational roles included the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo, Vietnam. And this was actually the last battalion to deploy to Vietnam. And there we have the 5th Battalion with the tiger's head on their banner.
Sergeant Bernard Lyle Smith served in this unit and was killed in the 9th of March 1969, but his son took up the baton and served in the regular army, only 5 when his father died, but he rose to the rank of Major General, so his father would be extraordinarily proud of that.
So we have 6th Battalion, 7, and you can see just behind 8 RAR.
So the 6th was formed at Enoggera, which is in Brisbane, and then the 7th raised at Puckapunyal in Victoria, and the 8th again Enoggera in Brisbane.
6th best known for its service at the Battle of Long Tan, a major battle in the Vietnam War for Australian troops. We have one surviving member of 6th Battalion who served in that conflict, in that battle, and that's Alan Fraser, a wonderful man who I don't think he marched today. And interestingly enough, the gentleman upon which the song I Was Only 19 was based, Michael Storen, served in 6th Battalion. I see Moose Gully there earlier on, who helped us with all our notes today as part of the Anzac Day Committee, just marching past.
So this is the Unley Concert Band, and in 2016 they were the National A-grade Concert Band champions. Followed by 9 Battalion, raised in Woodside in 1967. This was the youngest battalion of the regiment, and there were 11 major operations in Vietnam, many with heavy enemy contact.
Then we start with the linked battalions, the 2nd, 4th Battalion. When the 2 battalions were linked in 1973, the Vietnam War finished in effectively in 1973, and there was no need for the number of troops we had before, so some of the battalions were linked. The 2 formed into one. So for a period of time, 2 and 4 were served together as 2nd, 4th, and 5 and 7 served together as one.
Quite a history there, isn't there? Of
There is.
linking and delinking, and when you need more troops and when you can ease off a bit.
5-7 saw service in Iraq and Afghanistan before it was delinked, but also humanitarian service and peacekeeping service in East Timor, Solomon Islands, Cambodia and Rwanda. So saying it's not commonly known that since Federation, Australia has served in 60 areas of conflict, but at the same time we've served on over 90 peacekeeping, peacemaking and humanitarian deployments. So it's a healthy balance there, I think. Here's the Special Air Service, led by former Minister Marty Hamilton-Smith there.
And you can see their Sandy Berets, and this squadron's made up of 6 officers and 200 men.
I like this. During the Vietnam War, the Australians SAS gained a fearful reputation among the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese troops, who called them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle.
Yes, they definitely had the North Vietnamese number there.
We now move on to Group 10, the recent conflicts and peacekeepers, starting with Kuwait, the First Gulf War. Nearly 2,000 ADF members from all 3 services were deployed to Kuwait in response to Iraq's invasion in August of 1990. And this, of course, was known as the First Gulf War Desert Storm.
And then we have Somalia. That was the battle in Somalia. See John O'Grady leading his group there, was referred to as a grim fight for peace, which I think probably says it all. They were deployed on Operation Solace. Then we move on to the peacekeepers. And these were civilians, Army, Navy and RAAF members on Australian deployments overseas in support of UN and other peacekeeping operations since 1945.
And these were still very dangerous missions, weren't they? And we saw that in 1995 with the massacre at Rwanda, and 32 Australian peacekeepers attempted to protect thousands of people in a refugee camp.
Yes, that's little known. There were 4 medals of gallantry that used to be the Military Cross, awarded for their service in that very stressful time. And quite rightly, that service, which was supposed to be peacekeeping, has now been declared warlike.
We just saw Interfet East Timor.
Oh, yeah. Interfet was the United Nations mandated multinational force committed to East Timor to address the deteriorating situation following the East Timor's vote for independence from Indonesia. And we deployed troops there between 1999 and 2000. Had 9,000 coalition troops from a dozen nations there at its height.
Bill, there was a sort of a gap, if you like, between the late 70s or the mid-70s, and then we get to these in the early 90s. There are veterans who served who didn't go overseas in that period, and they actually some of them feel let down by the fact they never got to serve their country like that.
Yeah, they call it the Great Peace, and it is sad for them, because a lot of them, you join the army to serve, and preferably like to serve overseas. That's the role, and if you don't get to do it, it's disappointing. But it doesn't diminish their service. Their quality of their work and what they did and what they delivered is as good as anybody that did. Whether you got overseas or not is just chance, basically. The posting of the variance of the vagaries of the posting order, as we say.
We've now gone on to the next group, where we have Solomon Islands, also Border Protection Operations and the International Stabilisation Force at Timor-Leste. And we can see now the police, peacekeepers and Red Cross. Now, this includes UN civilian police and others who've served with UN peacekeeping forces. And the Red Cross are members who have served as volunteers in war zones. They're also marching with this group.
That's right.
And you can see there we've had people lining the streets for quite some time this morning, and they'll continue right throughout this march, which is so great to see, showing their thanks for these men and women who have served our country.
This is a relatively new group that was just on screen of the Defence civilians who rendered operational service. We've employed over 2,000 civilians at the Defence Science and Technology Organisation and its successive organisations, and these are people that have gone overseas to do work in support of our operations, our more offensive operations over there. This type of work started in the Vietnam War, and that organisation is based in Edinburgh. Over 219 civilian members have completed operational deployments in support of the ADF.
The Australian entertainment groups from 1999 to the current day, and they play an important role of boosting morale, don't they, and giving these soldiers and these servicemen and women just a bit of a break from the conflict, a time to forget. Yeah,
it's a little touch of home. I know John Schuman's been prominent overseas in the current conflicts, but the people you saw earlier were marvellous at raising morale. And comes the National Service organisation, the National Servicemen's Association, a great group of people. There were 2 national service schemes, from 51 to 59 for all 18-year-olds, and then of course the more prominent one, 65 to 72. And we have a good and active association under Barry Presgrave here in South Australia, and you can see them marching today. They're very proud of their service, And indeed, had things gone differently, these men didn't serve overseas, the majority of them, but had things gone differently, they definitely could. But they were ready to serve if required. And there's the vehicles carrying them.
It's interesting, in this modern day we forget about the conscription, don't we, really? In some ways it just doesn't seem to have been remembered as part of our Australian history, but 300,000 men were conscripted between 1951 and 1972.
And that's followed by the Australian Defence Force Health Services.
That's a very interesting group. It's led today by one of our most senior and respected veterans, Colonel Don Beard, AM, ED, RFD. It's sportsman, soldier and surgeon, extraordinarily highly respected, known as the Diggers Doctor, or in cricketing circles, there he is, they called him the Other Don. He saw service in the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, and then went direct from Japan to Korea, where he saw action at the Battle of Kapyong. Tells a fantastic story about bringing wounded out strapped to the sides of a main battle tank, and was very grateful that when the Chinese saw what he was doing, they stopped firing. But when he took the tank back empty without any wounded on the side, they started firing again. So got a free passage out, but not on the way back. Yeah. And look, he's a warm, generous and compassionate man, much loved by us all. Then the Royal Australian Navy. Former members. Here we go, the flyover of the...
This is the Poseidon.
The Poseidon, the new aircraft for anti-submarine warfare aircraft. So 3 flypasts today. We're exceptionally well served in that area.
And they're getting faster all the time too.
They are.
As you would expect.
Now we can see HMAS Encounter. And this was established in 1965. 400 service people were attached to HMAS Encounter.
That's the new addition to our fleet. Took over from the Orion aircraft.
And now we have TS Tingara.
It's basically a training organisation. The ship was, in fact, Tingara was built in 1866 in Scotland, named Tingara, which is the Aboriginal word for open sea. And it was purchased by Australia as a training ship in 1911. And this represents the other training establishments for the Navy that have followed.
Now we can see the Australian Army former members marching in that group there.
You see the pace of the march also picks up now, Bill.
It does. Now we have the Women's Royal Australian Army Corps that you can see there. This was formed in 1951 to perform similar roles to the wartime Australian Women's Army Service and released men for combat. That doesn't happen anymore, but they filled, those women filled duties as clerks, drivers, signal operators, switchboard operators, cooks and mess stewards. But it was disbanded in 1984 when they became part of the Integrated Army. And then the Officer Training Unit at Skyville. This was the organisation that trained national servicemen, men who were conscripted for 2 years. They could spend 6 months training to be an officer and then graduate as a second lieutenant and serve the balance of their service as a commissioned officer. They did a 22-week course, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And served in Vietnam, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia and Singapore.
Now we have the South Australian Mounted Rifles Association.
Descended from the Reed Speds Cavalry, established in our earliest colonial days.
Salisbury City Band coming up behind them. What's the difference in the pace now, Bill, from earlier?
Yes, they're stepping it out now, so it's interesting how they managed to combine all those men and women who are marching slowly early on with these that are marching so fast. Still managed to get them clear of the dispersal area and have a reasonable flow. I don't think we've noticed any halts today at all, which is something of was something that plagued us in the past.
You can see the Royal Australian Survey Corps there. Now, these members provided survey data and the compilation of maps as well, which are still used today in civilian role.
Although the Survey Corps was disbanded some years ago when, with the advent of global positioning, so it but provided very, very valuable service while it was part of the order of battle.
Forget how modern things have become, don't we, sometimes as well. Royal Australian Corps of Signals going through and the same sort of thing.
Well, I think the Survey Corps woke up in 1997 and realised in a sense that technology had overtaken them. So Signals, and then on to Group 13, the non-returned former and serving personnel. And as we said before, military service is so much a lottery. You know, some of the finest I know didn't see overseas service, but as I said before, it doesn't diminish the quality of their contribution. And there's the Royal South Australia Regiment, all of the members of the Royal South Australian Regiment from the late 1950s to the present time. Then the Royal Australian Corps of Transport, and this is basically some of these men have been deployed in warlike operations and non-warlike operations, as well as peacekeeping humanitarian roles since 1973 when that corps was established.
And you can see many of these members have medals that they were awarded that they're wearing on their left, but some of them are also wearing medals on their right, and that comes from their ancestors who also served.
The Royal Australian Corps of Transport was formed, as I said, in 73 from the combination of the Royal Australian Army Service Corps, the Engineers and the Royal Australian Service Corps. Elements of the Royal Australian Engineers.
The Army Ordnance Corps there, a crucial role of storing and supplying stores of equipment, everything to keep a Defence Force operational.
Absolutely, you don't go anywhere without the Ordnance Corps.
Bill, we've been talking about the numbers of World War II veterans dwindling as time passes, but in some cases we're seeing more veterans march. Sometimes it takes a bit of time for them to feel comfortable about it, isn't that right?
It does indeed. There was a veteran that was marching today. Unfortunately, I didn't see him. He was marching for the first time, an older veteran from World War II. So it takes a long time to come out of the woodwork, if I can, you know, to make sure you feel it's right. He was a member of the British forces, but the first time he's felt comfortable about marching.
The RSL can't be in contact surely with every veteran, though, Bill. Is that an issue? You just, as you said there, I think you mentioned the figure, there's about 1,000 veterans from World War II, but you're not sure of those exact numbers.
Well, the numbers, 1,085, come from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and they're the people that have made a claim of some sort or acknowledged their own existence to the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Commonwealth Department. The RSL is a different members-based organisation, so unless people actually come and join, we don't know that they exist. And indeed, there are people who've never gone to the Department of Veterans Affairs, so we really don't know how many veterans survive. We just know that the Department of Veterans Affairs think there's 1,085 in South Australia, and we would probably have contact with 500 or 600 of those.
And this is Ramey, the Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers.
Coming up, the very important Royal Australian Corps, Army Pay Corps, I should say, the Royal Australian Army Pay Corps. It's nice to be paid for what you do at the end of the day.
I should mention that, I said I'd give him a mention, that the RAF veteran, the Royal Air Force veteran who was marching for the first time was Bernard Rose. And didn't quite catch you on camera, Bernard, but we hope you had a good day and a happy march, your first march. Congratulations.
The Royal Australian Corps of Military Police. Now, their duties included security, escorts, close personal protection, also traffic route reconnaissance. So they play an important role as well. Then we have the Royal Australian Air Force.
City of Adelaide Squadron. That was formed in Amberley in 1940 and served in Darwin, New Guinea, and the Southwest Pacific area with a variety of aircraft until disbanded in Tokemwal in 1946. But was reformed in 1951 at Malala as a Citizen Air Force fighter squadron, and was granted the charter by the Adelaide City Council to incorporate City of Adelaide into its title. It's now a non-flying squadron where it carries out various roles. Now we come on to the Australian Defence Force, I think Group 14. Just see that behind the band of the Royal Australian Air Force. No, it was the Navy. We have 3,000 Australian Defence Force members deployed overseas in security training and detection roles, as well as border protection operations in and around Australia. These men are the current day Anzacs, proudly and capably carrying the mantle of the original Anzacs. And as we said, we've got the Royal Australian Navy leading.
South Australia currently has 210 permanent Navy personnel based mainly at Osborne and also Edinburgh Defence Precinct.
Following the Royal Australian Navy is the 1st Armoured Regiment. And this unit was formed in 1949 equipped with Centurion tanks, but now serves with A1 Abraham tanks. I should point out that the lead of that unit was the unit identifier was being carried by Lance Corporal Harley Wilson. Now, he's a cadet, a member of the 49th Army Cadet Unit at Smithfield. And apparently he's shown such a passion for armour and such an interest in the unit that the commanding officer of this unit has given him the honour of carrying the unit identifier. So that's unique, a cadet leading what is a regular Defence Force unit.
16th Air Land Regiment there. So 2019 is the 50th anniversary. It was previously known as 16 Light Aircraft Anti-Aircraft Regiment and 16 Air Defence Regiment.
We can see Bombardier Murray leading that unit, looking very healthy. He hasn't worried about, can we see him there in the centre of screen? He doesn't look as if the march has worried him at all, which is good given that he's just recovered from knee surgery. So that's great. We're talking about the dog there.
Just to confirm that.
Just in case.
Just in case. It's Bombardier Murray, who's been with us for a number of years, I think.
Now, a lot of these units have mascots, don't they, Bill?
They do.
But some are allowed to take part in the march and some aren't. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think it's just an arrangement with the Anzac Day Committee. Some of them simply can't. The ones that the armoured unit, one of the armoured units has a wedge-tail eagle. Others, I know, have had camels and the sort, so it's a bit difficult. But a dog's a bit easier because very soon, I think, if all goes according to plan, you'll see service dogs in the march. So dogs are perhaps allowed to. I know one of the mascots was a pig, and I know some years ago there was a move to have the pig march, but I think there were issues about its discipline that
well, yes,
stopped it happening.
Discipline and trust, that's
Yes,
the
right.
two things you need, I suppose. It's the Australian Army Band coming out now, and this is their second appearance in the march.
In terms of the Army, South Australia has quite a big presence. Some 1,950 members of the regular Army are here.
Yeah.
1,900 members of the Army Reserve live in South Australia as well.
That's right. Now we come on to, after the band, we
7
come on to
RAR.
7 RAR. They came to South Australia from Darwin in 2011, and as I've said before, they embraced South Australia. We've embraced them. It's a marvellous unit. It's the biggest unit in South Australia.
And as you were talking before, Bill, about mascots, their mascot is the pig, as I understand.
Well, it's not with us today.
No.
I do recall some years ago that it got as far as the bus in the assembly area. It was a piglet.
Oh dear.
But even then, they promised it would be carried, but had visions of it breaking free, so it didn't march. But these young men and women are today's Anzacs, and don't they look brilliant? They look as if they could do the job, and they certainly can. Many of them you'll see from their medals are returned, and they do us proud.
I think what's great to see as well, Bill, is so many people here taking an interest in not only people who have served in past conflicts, but people who are serving today. And I think we've been seeing that in the past couple of weeks as well. We had HMAS Adelaide come to visit in South Australia. There were 4,000 tickets available for people to go and see HMAS Adelaide, and it was snapped up within a few days, I think.
Absolutely.
People just still have such a big interest in what our Defence Forces do.
Absolutely, they're very. Our Defence Forces are marvellously supported, and that's how it should be. They're the people that are prepared to put their lives on the line if required. You know, at a moment's notice, rush off overseas and in some terribly challenging situation, either peacekeeping or humanitarian work, or indeed fighting a war, and they do it in our name, and that's what we recognise today.
And I was told that the average age on HMAS Adelaide of the crew was 20 years old.
Well,
that is
it's a young man's business and a young woman's business, yeah, a young person's business.
Now we have 1027 Battalion. So this is an Army Reserve Battalion based at Keswick here in South Australia.
Formed with a combination of 10 Battalion and 27 Battalion. Both battalions served at Gallipoli. 10 Battalion was part of the covering force, went ashore at 4 a.m. on it, the first Anzac Day. 27 Battalion came later on the 27th of September, a few months later. The two units amalgamated in 1987. And now it's a Army Reserve unit at Keswick Barracks. Followed by the 9th Combat Service Support Battalion, and this is the organisation that provides the transport, medical and maintenance services to the 9 Brigade units, the Army Reserve units.
And personnel have served in Rwanda, Iraq, Timor-Leste, Solomon Islands and Afghanistan.
That's right.
Makes quite a contrast with the next group coming through, the RAF Edinburgh.
Yes, that group you can see there is based at Edinburgh, the RAF Edinburgh, based at Edinburgh, which is the home of the broader defence community in South Australia. And for the RAF, Edinburgh provides intelligence, surveillance and a recce hub, and it's the home of 92 Wing. And 92 Wing comprises 10, 11 and 192 squadrons. But 92 Wing flew the APC-3 Orions and now the Boeing P-8 Poseidon that we saw. There are about 5,500 personnel posted to Edinburgh, 2,000 Air Force and 1,000 Army and others to make the 5.5, but a fairly big commitment.
If you keep your eyes out there, they should have 4 dogs with them somewhere there.
There's
There
3.
we go.
There's 3.
I think I can only see 3, but the promise I was given was there was going to be
No,
4.
we've got 3 there.
You never know.
And these military dogs, they work in protecting RAAF assets and establishments.
I said last year, and I repeat, that the training takes 2.5 years, but that's for the handler. I'm not sure how long it takes for the dogs. But I'd like to note that this last year saw the something special, the award to Army Dog Cougar of the Dickon Medal for Animal Gallantry in October last year. That dog was on service in Afghanistan and sensed an ambush, rushed forward and attacked the enemy to protect his handler, was shot 5 times. But sadly, in spite of the best efforts of vets from 5 nations, he died about a year later. But you know, I guess it's interesting. What does a dog know about gallantry? It's our interpretation of gallantry. But nevertheless, the dog did what he was trained to do and was awarded, from a human perspective, the highest, the Victoria Cross in the animal world.
Now we move on to our next group, the Women's Royal Naval Service, also the Royal Navy.
And then the Royal Marines. On their badge is a globe, which indicates they've served everywhere.
And you can see both blue and green berets. The blue berets, that means they served aboard battleships, cruisers, landing craft and went in with first assault troops, whereas the green, they served in commando units and special operations in the Middle East and Europe. And coming up behind them, the second appearance of the South Australian Police Band.
Very smart, don't they?
They do.
Well, they sound good anyway, that's for sure.
Second appearance. That's good.
Now we have...
Band, you can see the British Army, which includes all members of the British Army, World War II, not marching in other units. It's an indication, Bill, there's a place for everybody. The way that the RSL and SA has worked things out, there is a place for everybody. If you turn up,
Absolutely.
you will be able to find a unit or find where you served. And I think that's a great way that the RSL has worked to figure out, if you like, the march.
Yes, if you've got a tangible link with service, then, as you say, Neil, you can be there. You might be as a descendant, or you might be have served yourself. But definitely there is a place. We've got to remember it's about commemoration, so that's got to be the focus. So, you know, you're there. Well, 2 things really. You're there commemorating the service of those that have been lost or passed on, lost in war or passed on subsequently. That's the primary role of the day. It's a commemorative service. But at the same time, it gives the general public the opportunity to acknowledge and pay their respects to the people that have served, or indeed the ancestors of people, the ancestors who have served.
And that, when you say about that commemoration, that in conjunction with those who've served, you've worked out the RSL in South Australia. It's different to some of the other states in that if you're marching with those who have served with you, and if there's only a handful, well, there's only a handful. But
absolutely,
the ghosts of those who have passed are said to be with you.
That's right, Neil, and you see that particularly in those smaller World War II units. You saw it with the 2nd, 3rd Machine Gun Battalion, when only 3 survive of 800. There's a famous cartoon that shows a man marching on his own, and when questioned about that, it's a cartoon in the paper, when questioned why he's marching, he said, what do you mean on my own? And then in the background on the cartoon is all these rows and rows and rows of figures. So he's marching in his mind for his mates. And we should remember, in fact, remiss of me not to mention, but his unit went past very, very quickly, was dear Bill Corey, who was such a favourite of us all, a very loved man, had served his nation in the Middle East as a rat of Tobruk and then on in the Pacific. And Bill was with us last year in a vehicle, but he passed later in the year, aged 101. He just did so much, particularly in his latter years, and Bill will never be forgotten.
Just call me Bill, wasn't that his line?
Yeah, humble Bill, a butcher, just call me Bill. Bill always said that no matter how bad war was, how grim it was, and Bill saw some tough times, he said the thing that gave him solace in his latter years, that the little country boy always remained in charge. He never did anything, he was confident, never did anything he had to regret, because that little man from the bush, little boy from the bush, kept him under control. And it's a lovely thing to be able to say at the end of your military service, particularly the sort of service that Bill saw. We've got the British Imperials there. There's just one marcher there. This represents all the British armed services from all theatres in the Second World War.
And British ex-service women as well.
Yes.
So it's in British ex-service women at the peak of World War II. Britain had enlisted nearly 1 million women in its armed services women's units.
Then we can see Canada. And followed by France. And after the fall of France in June of 1940, many French citizens served in Allied forces or in free French units.
I'd also like to hark back to remember a man I should have mentioned in Group 5, Bill Renison. We fondly remember him today, a well-known South Australian. Bill flew with 22 Squadron in Borneo and Papua New Guinea, and he's long since gone, but we remember his service, and I know his family's listening in.
Just a reminder, you're watching the Anzac Day coverage on ABC with Neil Cross, Emma Rebellato and Bill Denny, the RSL ambassador. Bill, you hold it back, but we should remember you served as well. Can you tell us very briefly then?
No, my service is fairly insignificant compared with most.
Oh, come on, Bill.
No, I was in Transport Corps, so I wasn't at the leading edge like a lot of my colleagues were, but I enjoyed serving my country. I was very proud of my service, and I would have done whatever was required as a young man. It's a love of country and love of your mates. I served with some very good people, I was proud to do my bit at the time. I was a volunteer, but there's a much younger and much more talented generation now, and they do a marvellous job.
We can now see the Seymour College Pipe Band, the only female pipe band in Adelaide.
Yes, I saw them at an event yesterday at St Peter's, the unveiling of the Heroes Monument, or additions to the Heroes Monument yesterday. They are an impressive group. I wonder where the training that they need, I wonder where they get time to do their schoolwork.
And now we have Greece, and you can see the traditional costume there. This was an association founded in Adelaide by Greek migrants.
We are up for a bit of a treat a little later on too. Speaking of the Greeks, at the Cross of Sacrifice, the Greek Presidential Guard, we will see them there.
And that's the Hellenic Presidential Guard.
Oh, that's interesting. It's a bit of a surprise to see them. We're talking about the pace of the march, and 120 paces, I think, is the marching pace for the regular army units, and I think that I was told the Greek Presidential Guard if in marches at about 60 or 70, so it was going to be a challenging business, but they wear their traditional uniform called the Solis, I think, Solis. Stand to be corrected there.
Now behind we have other countries. We started with Malta, now you can see the Netherlands there, Poland and the United States of America.
See, just missed Malta there. I see Charlie Ferrugia in the red jacket. Chevalier Charlie Ferrugia, OAM. He's very well known in the ex-service community for all his hard work. The only representative of his group now. And as you say, we go on to the Netherlands and Poland and the United States of America.
There's Charlie. The Maltese colours date back to 1090 AD when they were awarded by Count Roger I of the Normans.
And Poland, you can see there, that is Raymond O'Girman, 93 years of age, came to Australia in 1952.
Somewhat surprising, nobody behind the United States there.
The Americans have fought alongside Australian forces in every major conflict since World War I. Now we are starting to see the descendants. Starting with the Boer War, and you can also see behind the Boer War the Royal Australian Navy and the Army Nursing Service.
As you said, Bill, this is the way it's broken up. So those who served go first, and then the descendants are followed, basically mirroring the way the march has gone, just they will march behind all those who've actually served.
That's exactly right. It's a way to give them all an opportunity to commemorate the service of an ancestor, to do it in a way that's both respectful in a service sense and hopefully makes sense to the those that have come out to watch.
And all the descendants are wearing the medals on their right. If they served, they're wearing them on their left.
That's right. And as you see, you can see here that there we are. There's a set of World War II medals. That gentleman is obviously marching in honour of probably his grandfather, I would suggest. And there you see a set of World War I medals. The gentleman in the middle's wearing a military medal in the centre, so his ancestor was decorated for bravery in the field. The military medal.
Of course, the descendants coming through reminds us that we are getting towards the end of today's march. But don't forget, we will have the Cross of Sacrifice ceremony as well. And then at 12:30, we'll be crossing to Turkey for the Gallipoli Dawn service. And at 1:30, that'll be followed by the Dawn service from Villers-Bretonneux in France. So stay with us on ABC TV throughout the afternoon. It's not quite the afternoon yet, but it will be. I'm sure it'll come.
Now what we're seeing here is a few signs. Still not many people marching behind them, but some of the signs that we'll be seeing in this section were signs that have been actually retired from the first section. Absolutely.
Yes, once they're retired, because we haven't had any marches for 3 years, then they're brigaded and they're grouped at the back of the particular group, so that they're not completely out of the march, but it indicates that there appears to be no marchers left to participate. Of course, they can be brought out again if a marcher comes up. I know that's happened. Somebody decided to march and their sign had been retired some time before, so it was brought out of retirement. Here's the group 17. Just moved on to group 17, the descendants of World War II, and you can see the units.
We've seen the Australian Women's Services, the Australian Women's Land Army, followed by the Royal Australian Navy.
You can't understand don't misunderstand the sense of loss that a lot of these people still feel. Loss and pride. You know, the loss hasn't gone away, but they feel enormous pride in the service of their ancestor. There's an interesting
So
Now,
they
that
should.
gentleman's ancestors had some amazing service. Once again, a military medal in World War I, and then lots of World War II service there. There are people today, I don't know whether there was a gentleman earlier on under the RAAC veterans, John Cambridge. His family have served 4 generations have seen service from Anzac right through to his son who's currently serving. So there's some families that have had military service in every single generation.
Speaking of families, Bill, we're going to see soon, we're going to see an Indigenous family that has an interesting
That's right.
method of acknowledging service.
Yes, they have. The Lakoviak family, I think we'll see in a minute, who great-grandfather of John Lakoviak was Arthur Thomas Walker, who died at Battle of Mookie Farm, serving with 50 Battalion in World War I. But every generation of his family since then have named a son Anzac, and indeed the current Anzac is 17, plays for Sturt, Neil, so keep an eye out for him. But I just saw one of the retired signs go past, the 2nd 6th Cav Commando Regiment. Now that was a sign we expected to see earlier up. It's been retired, and I'd like to mention John Redwood, who was a very regular marcher in that unit. Now John's gone, and now all his mates have gone, and no one for 3 years, so his sign's been retired.
And Bill, we've actually lost a few World War II veterans in this past year, haven't we?
Well, we have, yes. It's amazing to... well, they're all getting to a bit of... The youngest, I think, would be 93 if they joined the Navy at the first opportunity they got towards the end of the war. And the oldest, of course, is Sid I. Now, as far as we know, and we don't know, but we think that he's the oldest. Dear Sid is a member of one of our RSL sub-branches. He served in the 2nd 8th Field Ambulance. He was a RAD of Tobruk and then went on to serve in the Pacific Theatre. Still hard and hard. He plays at his 8-ball, a game every Wednesday afternoon with the local RSL. I spoke to the Premier yesterday, who'd seen him only last Wednesday when the Premier went out there. And Sid still lives on his own at 103. And
Absolutely amazing.
Keeps to himself, but we're very fond of him and very proud of him, and you did such a great job, Sid.
Australian Merchant Navy. Seeing descendants march there. I think, Bill, what's been really nice is that dotted through the crowd we're seeing people who have already marched, our veterans who've already marched early in the earlier groups, but they're going to stand by the side of the road to pay their respects to not only the current members, but also now we're seeing the descendants, and they're still there and they're still paying their respects.
Yes, that's it. That's important, and that's part of what Anzac's all about, because primarily, you know, it is a commemorative service. It's a commemorative service, and of course, what we're seeing is the public acknowledgement of service, but it's primarily probably 60-40. It's about commemoration, and these ones, the marchers and the latter groups, well, they didn't serve themselves, so they're not remembering their mates who died alongside them, but they're remembering their ancestor that served. So the sense of commemoration and remembrance is exactly the same. Whereas in the earlier parts of the march, they're remembering their mates and they're marching with a purpose. I keep referring to them, but you see it very clinically with the 2nd, 3rd Machine Gun Battalion. I know those men, and I know how hard it was for them to get out today at 98. You know, and it was a real effort, and they did it. As I said before, they did it for their mates and they did it for us.
And now we're seeing the post-World War II conflicts. So we saw Korea, Malay and Borneo, Vietnam.
So these are descendants of men that served in the Vietnam conflict and have passed away.
And these are now descendants of Allied countries. So you can see on screen there, Britain, British India. Behind that is France. And something that Ian Smith, RSL Anzac Day Committee Chair, spoke about in the dawn service is the role that migrants have played in Australia. It's sort of, and you're seeing the descendants of these migrants who served in Allied countries, and they're now taking part in these commemorations.
Which, as it should be. You know, it's lovely that we're such an inclusive nation and everybody gets the opportunity to have their service recognised as service of a loved one.
And speaking of recognising service, Bill, we also have talked about Indigenous war veterans, those who have served. And you attended there's a special service that takes place after the dawn service before the march gets underway, and you attended that as well?
Yes, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial, which is situated on the corner of Torrens Parade Ground, is a marvellous memorial, probably the most significant of its sort in the nation. But each year at 8 o'clock in the morning, almost shortly after the conclusion of our dawn services at the State National War Memorial, the Aboriginal community get together, and their veterans have a similar service. It's they call it it's a dawn service, but it's also a yarn-up, which is their term for getting together and having a bit of a chat. And it was good to see them there today. I see the Premier came, and it's getting more popular every year, but it's lovely to see them. And it ties in with a marvellous event yesterday where at Tindania, a country arts SA exhibition has been launched on all the Aboriginal veterans who served in Vietnam, and it's well worth seeing. It was launched last night by His Excellency the Governor. It's called One In, All In.
Bill, we're talking about Anzac Day, and we know the main dawn service is held on North Terrace, but they're held right around the state. You were journeying around the state in the past week or so, and just found some very interesting memorials that are around the state as well to do with our Anzacs.
Yes, thank you, Neil. Yes, I did a trip. Did a trip last week up to the north, and went through lots of little towns like Burra, Tarawa, Craddock, Hawker, Port Germain and Port Broughton, and I got a sense of the preparation that all those towns were going to create their have their Anzac Day service, and it truly is quite special, the amount of effort those small country towns put into putting on a good show. And I think the best one of all was Craddock. It's got a population of 7, and it has one commercial building, the pub, but it's got this most magnificent war memorial, which has been, they've raised funds and they've constructed it. Why I say it's not the best, it's symptomatic of all those lovely towns up there, but they're putting on a marvellous service today, and it really does gives another dimension to it gives a dimension and lets you understand all those young men who served in World War I, where they were. Craddock was a booming town in the, well, not a booming town, but a significant town in the early 1900s, and that's where a lot of our World War I soldiers came from those areas that now no longer settled, the rural areas of South Australia.
Well, when you look at the population at the time of World War I think it was fewer than 5 million in Australia, and a huge amount went overseas to serve. So every community, every town, every part of Australia and South Australia was impacted.
Yes, it definitely was.
Well, we are getting close to the conclusion of the march.
I'd like to mention, we just saw his family go past. I didn't get a chance to acknowledge them on screen, but Hans de Vries was a prominent marcher. He was he's a Dutch citizen who was in Indonesia at the time of the Japanese invasion. He was 18 years of age and was flown. He had to leave Indonesia with the Japanese advancing, and became a member of the 18th Netherlands East Indian Squadron, a combined squadron with the RAAF. His grandchildren, Amanda and Jeremy, marched today in his honour. He was a sergeant pilot in the Royal Netherlands Naval Air Force, and he was forced to leave, but as a B-25 pilot he was invited to do the Victory flyover in Sydney, and he's the one that on a dare flew under the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You often hear that story, although I think quite a few flew under. I remember another fellow I knew, Joe Groves, claimed that he flew under in a Lancaster, so apparently that was the go-to thing to do at the end of the war if you're in the Air Force and you're a pilot. But we remember Hans, he was a grand man and rendered a wonderful service to our country.
So we can see now the City of Adelaide Pipe Band and 413 Army Cadet Unit Pipes and Drums.
Following them behind there, you see the Australian Air Force Cadets. So the Air Training Corps was formed in 1941 by the RAAF to provide teenage boys with preliminary Air Force training to assist the World War II effort. As we said, 80 years I should say, this year since the outbreak of World War II.
Air Force cadets.
Some of these cadets also were involved last night in the Anzac Eve Youth Vigil. It's a marvellous event at the State National War Memorial every Anzac Eve, and 10 youth and community groups stand guard around the memorial all night and have a service of remembrance at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and it's a marvellous way to educate the young ones about Anzac, but do it in a way that's pro-peace, if I can use that term. It allows them to commemorate in a respectful way.
And now we can see our Anzac Day marshals, 120 marshals, and they help coordinate the volunteers. 1,400 volunteers carry signs, drive vehicles, provide music and support for the march.
Yes, leading those was Tony Chaplin, who's the Chief Marshal, but I'd like to acknowledge Ian Smith, the Chairman of the committee, and all the marshals, as you say. The Military Vehicle Preservation Society, which provides the vehicles. There's Dave Carman, who's a member of the Anzac Day Committee, following on behind the marshals. He's the chair of the Military Vehicle Preservation Society. The cadets, the bands, the St John Ambulance, the RAA. Special thanks to Adelaide City Council. And Signs Incorporated. Tony Slattery was the owner of that company, an infantryman in Vietnam, served with distinction, a great man. He passed a few years ago, but Signs Incorporated still continue to provide signs to the Anzac Day March at no cost. I think this last few years, 156 signs. They do that in Terry's memory, and we acknowledge his service and their marvellous contribution, which makes and helps the public understand what's going on, and us to a very large degree.
So we saw there the Barossa Light Horse Historical Association, and that's the traditional end of the march after, of course, the police greys started the march. And that concludes our coverage of the march. We will have the Cross of Sacrifice that will follow very, very soon.
On this Anzac Day, we of course honour all war veterans. Those who fought in World War I are no longer with us, as we've talked about, but many actually lay in unmarked graves. However, a group of volunteers in South Australia is working to ensure that these veterans are given the recognition that they deserve. It's a methodical and at times painstaking process. With a map of the North Road Cemetery at Nailsworth, volunteers begin their search.
So this is plot 14, row 35. It looks like a candidate, so we'll mark him up.
They are searching for unmarked graves and the remains of World War I soldiers which may lie beneath.
We quite rightly memorialise and look after those that had died during war, but it's the returned soldiers usually are forgotten, and that's a sad indictment on our country, and I think we need to do something about that. The search for these forgotten soldiers began in SA 2 years ago, when volunteers from the Headstone project suspect an unmarked grave belongs to a World War I soldier. Burial records are checked against overseas service records.
If there's a match, the project aims to place a headstone and plaque to honour that person's service.
These are the men that literally fell through the cracks because they really largely had no entitlement to any kind of Commonwealth benefit. And so their burials were largely left to families where they had them, or they finished up in paupers' graves.
It's a story June McVicker knows all too well. Her father-in-law Archibald McVicker saw action in France as a gunner before returning home to Port Pirie. When he died years later, his grave was left without a headstone.
His wife couldn't afford to put one there. You know, just the grave was all she could afford. She had 5 children and one on the way when Archie died. So she could, and no pensions. There was nothing she could do other than bury him.
More than half a century after his death, the Headstone project stepped in. Archibald McVicker's grave is the first of 2 in South Australia to be honoured with a headstone. His descendants travelled from across the country for the dedication ceremony.
It was very moving because one of my grandsons was in the Navy band in Adelaide, so he actually played the last post. Another one of my grandsons was in the Air Force, so he actually was allowed to read the poem that only an ex-serviceman can read. And the other grandson read the eulogy and thanked everyone for coming.
The project has so far identified more than 50 other unmarked graves in South Australia, from Kimber on Eyre Peninsula to the Riverland, the South East and Adelaide. But there could be more than 1,000 across the state.
This is going to take some time. It's going to take resources and funding. And so it could be something I'll be doing for the next 10, 15 years.
We believe that any person who puts on a uniform for his country deserves recognition, at least in death, if he hasn't been recognised in life.
The Headstone project began in Tasmania in 2011. 500 headstones have been installed there, but the project believes there could be several hundred more graves still to be identified.
I have one lady who comes to every dedication now, doesn't matter where we have it, but she is just so grateful for what we did that she does now have a place where she can go and mourn her grandfather. And this is important as part of the grieving process.
The RSL agrees individual memorials provide a vital link to the past.
I think the critical thing about it is anyone can come here and see this beautiful memorial walkway, but it lacks the individuality of a grave. Being able to go to a grave and see an inscription on a grave is really special, very important for family members, but also, you know, it's a piece of history. It's an important piece of history.
The Headstone project survives by seeking money from state and federal governments, support from the RSL, as well as donations and sponsorship. It's aiming to set up a national body by year's end.
To encourage local groups, whether it's a family history society or an RSL or someone who's just simply got an interest in their local cemetery, to start looking at who might be in the unmarked graves.
It makes me proud. It makes me proud of the sorts of people that are willing to volunteer their time to do this sort of work. It's really important to commemorate our war dead, and these people are just as much the war dead as those who fell overseas.
The project estimates there could be 12,000 soldiers nationally who should be honoured. A huge task, but one the volunteers feel compelled to continue.
I understand that I can't really understand what these men and women went through 100 years ago, but it doesn't mean I shouldn't try. And to tell their stories, that's the important thing.
And I have to say it was an absolute privilege to meet at least 2 members of the Headstone project in South Australia. They have about 25 volunteers and they are doing such a fantastic job. Really worthwhile cause.
Great story. Well, this year, of course, as we've already talked about, is the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, a titanic struggle that saw close to 1 million Australians serve in the armed forces. And the stories of those men and women have been an inseparable part of Anzac Day and, of course, our national identity. But of that 1 million veterans, only a handful remain and their time is limited. Again, we've spoken about that. Simon Royal has this story.
Keith Fowler, Chook to his mates, spent 3 years as a prisoner of war, forced by his captors to work on the notorious Thai-Burma Railway. The slightest hint of defiance could mean death, a lesson the Australians learned early from a Japanese guard they dubbed Bill the Bastard.
Well, he was a bastard. He was a thorough one. I mean, he'd built you for the least little thing, you know.
Keith Fowler is one of almost 1 million Australians who served in World War II. Of those who fought overseas, 30,000 never returned. Now the years are inevitably and rapidly moving through the ranks of the rest. In June 2017, the Department of Veteran Affairs had 23,000 World War II vets on its books. In June 2018, it was 13,278, the very last of their generation.
They gave so much at a difficult time, and they presented Australia to us virtually on a platter. What they delivered to our nation, I don't think we can ever say. We can't provide them enough recognition for that.
It is the stories of former POWs that are, in many ways, a defining feature of World War II. Historian Robin Pryor says the numbers tell the tale. 4,000 Australians were taken prisoner in the First War. In the Second, it was over 30,000.
Each of their stories is different, and each experience of captivity is different, and you lose that mosaic of memory when those people go.
There'll be books and diaries and films, so we won't forget. But it's one thing to read about the night Norm Ginn's Lancaster bomber was shot down over Berlin. It's something else to hear him recall floating down to the snow-covered German countryside. Only one sound in the near-perfect silence.
At that stage I could just hear our bombers gradually fading in the distance, and of course that was a pretty lonely feeling, as you can imagine, not knowing what was going to happen.
Norm spent 2 years in a Nazi prison camp. No commemoration is static, Anzac Day included. There are no World War I veterans left today. But Robin Pryor believes that when the last World War II veteran goes, it will be the most profound change to Anzac Day.
The chance to see those people from the Second World War, the most important war, I would argue, that we'd ever fought in, will be fleeting and will only last for a few more years.
Some of the veterans from the Second World War, and indeed other conflicts, are amongst the nation's most needy. But they can be effectively invisible to authorities, according to a leading mental trauma specialist. Professor Sandy McFarlane says the only way former servicemen and women come to the attention of the federal government is if they have a veterans healthcare card, something a surprising number choose not to take. In Britain's darkest hour, Gordon James fixed the planes that fought the Luftwaffe. To a 15-year-old apprentice mechanic, it was all a bit of fun.
I wasn't scared. I tried to be cocky, you know. Like when the night bombing was happening at the sergeant, he goes, and my father said, we'll all go to the shelter. And I said, oh no, I'm going to stay in bed. So the first one dropped, and I was down the stairs and in the shelter, you know what I mean?
His son knows that story well, but not many others do. After coming to Australia, Gordon James never joined the RSL. He doesn't have a veterans healthcare card. Ian James says there's every chance authorities in the UK and Australia don't know his dad exists.
I think in some ways it's a bit sad because there must be a number of veterans that are like that who, through no fault of their own, just fell through the cracks.
Veterans advocate Bill Denny believes Mr James's story is indeed indicative of a wider problem.
There is no master list of the number of veterans. All they will know about is the people that have actually made a claim against Department of Veterans Affairs, and we just don't know how many have done that.
Bill Denny is now launching a mission to find lost veterans, appealing to families and nursing homes to come forward.
It's not just a physical responsibility, it's a commemorative responsibility.
Straight across, mate.
Veterans who go missing in peace are a problem across all conflicts. And as psychiatrist Professor Sandy McFarlane has discovered, it's often those who need help the most.
and we find that as many as approximately 45% of those with post-traumatic stress disorder are actually not getting those services through the Department of Veterans Affairs. So there's actually a sizable number who, for multiple reasons, don't go down the path that everybody anticipates.
The Productivity Commission is now reviewing how the DVA delivers healthcare and compensation to veterans, something Sandy McFarlane welcomes.
If you want people to fight to protect your nation's interests, you have to provide them with optimal quality healthcare if they do get injured. And there's always been the idea that the veterans get a better standard of healthcare than the broader community at large. And I think that need and that idea is being lost and diluted at the present time.
Taking care of the past with an eye to the future.
So shortly we'll be going to the service at the Cross of Sacrifice. But yes, that's a very worthwhile story, that one. And what we're going to show you now is the band played Waltzing Matilda. If you remember Eric Bogle's song, it shows us the images of Australians serving their country.
Now when I was a young man, I carried me pack, and I lived the free life on the rover. From the Murray's green basin to the dusty outback, well, I waltzed my Matilda all over. Then in 1915, my country said, son, it's time you stop rambling, there's work to be done. So they gave me a tin hat, and they gave me a gun, and they marched me away to the war. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as the ship pulled away from the quay. And amidst all the cheers, the flag waving and tears, we sailed off for Gallipoli. And how well I remember that terrible day, how our blood stained the sand and the water, and of how in that hell that they called Sula Bay, we were butchered like lambs at the slaughter. Johnny Turk, he was waiting, he primed himself well, he showered us with bullets, and he rained us with shell, and in 5 minutes flat, he'd blown us all to hell. Nearly blew us right back to Australia. But the band played Waltzing Matilda when we stopped to bury our slain. How we buried ours, the Turks buried theirs, then we started all over again. And those that were left, we tried to survive in that mad world of blood, death and fire. And for 10 weary weeks I kept myself alive, though around me the corpses piled higher. Then a big Turkish shell knocked me off overhead, and when I woke up in me hospital bed and saw what it had done, I wished I was dead. Never knew there was worse things than dying. For I'll go no more waltzing Matilda all around the green bush far and free, to Hogton, to Paris, A man needs both legs. No more waltzing Matilda for me. So they gathered the crippled, the wounded, the maimed. They shipped us back home to Australia. The armless, the legless, the blind, the insane, those proud wounded heroes of Suvla. And as our ship sailed into Circular Quay, I looked at the place where me legs used to be, and thank Christ there was nobody waiting for me to grieve, to mourn and to pity. But the band played waltzing Matilda as they carried us down the gangway. But nobody cheered, they just stood and stared. Then they turned on their faces away. And so now, every April, I sit on me porch, I watch the parade pass before me. I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, reviving old dreams and past glories. And the old men march slowly, all bones stiff and sore, the tired old heroes from the forgotten war. And the young people ask, what are they marching for? And I ask myself the same question. But the band plays waltzing Matilda, and the old men still answer the call. But as year follows year, more old men disappear. Someday no one will march there at all. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? And their ghosts may be heard as they march by that billabong. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me?
Eric Bogles and the band played Waltzing Matilda, and Neil Cross, Emma Rebellato and Bill Denny with you for our coverage of the Cross of Sacrifice, which will be coming up very, very soon. But Bill, I'm glad that we've moved on from the sentiments that came through in that song about, you know, what are you marching for?
It's to look at it. It just brings a tear to the eye. I think we all know what we're marching for. I've spoken to Eric about that song, and we understand why I wrote it and the sentiments of the 1970s. But it's about remembrance, and I guess that brings us to the point of, I don't know how many World War II veterans we saw today, maybe 40. We'll count that up later on. But there are so many more at home who may never march again. True heroes, you know, and they may not march again. People like David Lester of Bomber Command, probably the most highly decorated and gallant Bomber Command pilot in Australia, and Kevin Dennis, who was decorated by the British government for his Bomber Command work, and lots of men like that. You know, they've got to be at least 1,000, and they may never march again. So many of them, it's assessed 33 and a third % are in nursing homes or care. So, you know, if we can find them, when people visit other relatives and they know a World War II veteran is in the bed next door, say good day and say thank you for your service, and let them know that their efforts weren't in vain.
And as we can see now at the Cross of Sacrifice, preparations are getting underway for the final part of our trilogy of commemorations here in Adelaide. And you can see members of the Hellenic Presidential Guard, and they are forming a special place in today's service. The Presidential Guard was first established in 1868. And they're made up of elite Greek soldiers trained for ceremonial duties. And we, of course, know them best for the changing of the guard ceremony at the tomb of the unknown warrior in Athens. So soon the Governor, Hugh Van Lay, will arrive for the service to commence at the Cross of Sacrifice. This is the final part of commemorations here in Adelaide. We started with a dawn service at the National War Memorial on North Terrace. That was this morning, followed by the march, where we gave thanks to all of those who have served, past and present, those here with us and those who are no longer with us. And so we had the dawn service, which is like the funeral service, followed by the march to the burial site, and that's what this service at the Cross of Sacrifice will represent, the burial to remember the war dead.
So we saw there, as we said, the Greek Presidential Guard, and Bill, the Greek Presidential Guard will be making, well, it's their first appearance that we've seen, and also at this stage it'll be their last appearance as well. It's a one-off this year.
It is. I think they've appeared in other states. They come around and are involved. I wasn't expecting to see them in the Anzac Day March itself. That's a bit of a surprise, but they were always scheduled to be here and provide a guard of honour for the Governor, which is a significant honour for them and an honour for us as well.
So they wear the traditional Greek uniform worn by the soldiers during the Greek War of Independence from 1821 to 1830.
And did you know in their shoes, the sole of the shoe has 60 nails? So it's designed to make a really loud noise when striking the ground, as you can see during their marching style. And it gives the impression of soldiers marching towards an enemy and the noise of battle. The Cross of Sacrifice that we're seeing today for this final service. The cross and the stone of remembrance are from the women of South Australia who were mourning their fallen servicemen during the Great War, and it became a place for them to mourn. It was their way of burying the dead, to say goodbye to their loved ones who they weren't able to bury at home, who lay in the graves overseas where they fell. And this is why the Anzac commemorations end here. So it's the burial part of the funeral.
Yes, it's interesting that it is three parts, you know, the dawn service and the march and the Cross of Sacrifice ceremony. And a lot of focus is put onto the march because that's where you can acknowledge the service rendered. But the commemorative aspect, this is the commemorative heart of it all. And it is of equal importance as the march.
Bill, how do you see, and how does the RSL, do you think, see Anzac Day looking forward? We're seeing lots of people here in the crowd for this final service. We also saw many lining the streets of the city to thank our servicemen and women. But how do you see it moving forward as we're losing more and more of our veterans?
Well, I guess we've had a similar challenge over the years. We lost our last World War I veteran in, I think, 2010, I think it was, a fair while ago now. But how we'll see it in the future, I think, it'll be very similar to what it is now, but the generations will pass. You'll see the Vietnam veterans sort of starting to lead the march, and the more contemporary veterans will fill up the groups, and then we'll still always have the descendants. But I imagine that numbers will slowly decrease because you've got that great rump of relatives from World War II and the World War II veterans will be gone.
But you would have thought, Bill, that there'll be more veterans alive, if you like, because they've survived the conflicts that they've fought, so there'll be more marching like that?
Yes. Well, we've had a lot of, we had a large number of deployments to the Middle East, but a number of those are because people went on several occasions, so the numbers aren't necessarily that great compared with other conflicts. I should clarify, Howard Pope was the last World War I veteran to die, and he last marched in 1999. He passed 101, not what I said before. So I suppose in the next 4 or 5 years, the last of the World War II veterans will go, and then it'll be down to Korea and Malaya and Borneo to lead the march.
The Cross of Sacrifice, which plays such a significant role at the end of these Anzac commemorations in Adelaide, was officially unveiled on Anzac Day in 1922. And that was in conjunction with the Returned Servicemen's Parade, which finished at that memorial. So as a tribute as well, there's a scroll with the names of Adelaide's lost, and that's enclosed within the base of the cross. And as you'll be seeing in the garden there, you can see flags flying at half-mast. There's rosemary planted in the garden, and that is for remembrance. There's also symbolic red and white roses in the garden. So a very significant end to these commemorations in Adelaide. After the Cross of Sacrifice ceremony, we will take you to Turkey for the dawn service at Gallipoli, and that will be followed by commemorations at Villa Bretonneux in France. Bill, we heard from the Australian War Memorial Director, Dr. Brendan Nelson, a few days ago, talking about Australia's Second World War veterans. He described these veterans as the best generation. Would you agree with him?
Yeah, I think we would. They've certainly delivered a marvellous community and marvellous nation to the generation that followed them. They faced some of the biggest challenges. They faced the Depression, they faced World War II. They were, in a sense, creating our state in a way, and they did it very, very well and delivered to my generation something for which we should be extraordinarily grateful. So I tend to agree with him. I've always seen them as their sense of sacrifice, their sense of duty, and it's, just to volunteer to do what they did and go away, for some of them married and go away for 6 years and never not see their wife at all for that whole period. It's an amazing sense of sacrifice and service.
I heard a tale this morning told at the National War Memorial in Canberra, I believe, but it was talking about a soldier who had said to his love, "Don't marry me." Because he was going away, and he was of the belief that he would not come back. And they ended up being married, I think it was for 50 plus years when he came back.
Oh, there's many stories like that, and the challenge involved with that type of separation, very hard on those left behind and, of course, those that are serving.
So we're waiting for the Governor, Hugh Van Lay, to arrive at the Cross of Sacrifice. He is actually just past our commentary position, so we can tell you that he's going to be there. He's come from Government House, and we will see him in just a few moments walk through the honour guard there, which includes the Greek Presidential Guard.
And we've seen throughout today's commemorations, particularly during the march, many people in the crowd were applauding and giving and showing their thanks, their gratefulness to these servicemen and women. But this really is a solemn occasion, and that's what we'll be seeing now with the ceremony here at the Cross of Sacrifice. It is a solemn commemoration. This represents the burial of the funeral. So we had this service this morning, followed by the march, the procession to the burial site. And here is the Governor, Hugh Van Lay. So we will shortly commence our ceremony here at the Cross of Sacrifice.
I must say, I know from experience that Hugh Van Lay does like a chat, so we might see him stop along the way.
He told a marvellous story last night about meeting a veteran in Cooper Pedy not all that long ago, who had a Vietnam veteran who had isolated himself out of the war because he was so doubting of the value of his service and how that related to him as a person, so he locked himself away for so long. And the governor was able to say, it's because of people like you that I'm able to be where I am now. And that had a marvellous impact on the man to know that his service was seen of value.
As you saw there, Hugh Van Lay just stopping to nod. I'm sure he would have chatted, but the Greek Presidential Guard staying in formation and staying at attention.
I'm not sure what His Excellency's Greek's like. I'm sure he would have practiced a phrase or two.
So we'll see the ceremony here at the Cross of Sacrifice, and that will be followed by the laying of wreaths as well.
And then we'll be off to the dawn service at Gallipoli.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the mounting of the catafalque party. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. This service of remembrance, conducted following our Adelaide March, is unique to this city and state. Officially opened in 1922, these gardens were developed and funded by women, for women, especially for widows seeking to honour the sacrifice of their men who died in the First World War. Known as the Garden of Memory, with the cross of sacrifice at one end and the stone of remembrance at the other, these gardens have now become a place of peace and reflection for all generations, as we remember all men and women, young and old, who have served this nation with sacrifice and distinction. Not only do we gather this morning in the shadow of St. Peter's Cathedral, but more significantly in the shadow of Easter, where we remember the greatest sacrifice the world has known, the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ. Indeed, it is by that sacrifice that we've come to understand all sacrifice. Hence, our memorial is a cross, and these very gardens are in the shape of a cross, the symbol of Jesus' death. The hymn, O Valiant Hearts, was written by Sir John Stanhope Arkwright in 1925, and it captures this very connection between the sacrifice of Jesus and those in war. And it offers a theme of hope, that those who have given of themselves freely in sacrifice like Christ will also share with him that same hope of resurrection to new life. Let us stand together and sing, O Valiant Hearts. Please be seated. We pause now for our prayers of remembrance. Eternal God, we remember those members of Australian military forces who made the supreme sacrifice in times of war. We thank you for their courage, skill and dedication and their willingness to serve. We pray that the offering of their lives not be in vain. May your grace enable us to honour their legacy and dedicate our lives to the cause of justice, freedom and peace. We remember this day too the widows and other loved ones who have been grieved through war. Comfort them with your presence and through family and friendships. We pray for our veterans. We thank you for their service in defence of our nation and to defend the lives, well-being and freedom of others. Strengthen and encourage them and help those who continue to suffer the effects of war to know healing and recovery. We remember those who currently serve our nation, including those deployed on operations. We ask for safety amidst chaos, wisdom in decision-making, refreshment for the fatigued, and peace over anxiety. Amen. The hymn Eternal Father Strong to Save was written by William Whiting in 1860 and was inspired by Psalm 107 and the story of Jesus calming the stormy seas. A mainstay in navies for generations, it inspires hope and faith amidst the darkness and chaos of stormy seas. And it reminds us that no matter how dark and chaotic life is, even in battle, Christ still has authority and power and meets us there. I invite you to stand and sing Eternal Father Strong to Save. In a moment we will have the laying of 3 wreaths, followed by the ode, last post, a minute's silence and rouse. A brief word of explanation. A memorial such as this cross of sacrifice represents our fallen. Memorials are made to symbolise before us today the bodies of those who may be lost or buried far away. This symbolises them being before us this morning. Wreaths have been used since ancient times to honour courage and bravery, as well as for mourning. In ancient times, a deceased body waiting for burial might be laid on a large stone, a catafalque, and guarded by soldiers. This is why we have a catafalque party, respectfully guarding protecting the fallen. If you were to stay in barracks, you'd be woken each morning by the trumpet playing of reveille or rouse and sent to sleep at night with the last post. And here they are reversed deliberately. The last post signifies that our fallen have now gone to sleep in death, and our minute's silence is to let them do so, to not awaken them. Their duty, their service is complete. The flag is at half-mast, symbolising that the invisible flag of death has been raised above it, as if triumphant. But then the silence is broken with the rouse, a call to wake up. This expresses the Easter hope we have that death is not the end of the story. Instead, we look forward to resurrection and to new life again. And so the flag returns to full mast, declaring that death is defeated and that our hope for resurrection and new life wins the day. I now invite His Excellency to place a wreath. Members of Legacy Youth. And representatives of the War Widows Guild. We come now to the reciting of the ode from Lawrence Binyon's poem, For the Fallen. Following this, please stand fast for the playing of the last post, minute's silence and reveille. They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning we will remember them, lest we forget.
Carnival party. 8-10, done. Carnival party. Present. Arms.
We have gathered here in remembrance of the men and women who have served this nation with distinction, many at the cost of their lives. All have set an example for us to follow. And in this special garden, we have remembered too the widows and families who grieve the loss of husbands, fathers, sons and uncles, and indeed for all who have suffered loss in generations since. And now may you know the encouragement and comfort of God's presence on this day of remembrance. And may Almighty God bless and enable you to live justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly, to serve Him, one another, and His creation. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain upstanding for the playing of the national anthems of New Zealand and Australia.
Well, that concludes our service from the Cross of Sacrifice. Stay with us. Very soon we'll be heading to the dawn service in Gallipoli. But first, we know sport has an intrinsic link with Anzac Day and with our veterans. And Australian rules football is often scrutinised for the injuries it causes, but there's a relatively new adaptation of the game using wheelchairs, and it's helping Australian men and service women recover from the physical and mental injuries they've suffered. The National Championships were held in Adelaide recently. I went along, talked to some of the competitors. Navy seaman Mark Daniels was 22 years old when he was horrifically injured in a motorcycle accident.
I was struck by a distracted vehicle. It resulted in a broken neck, 11 broken ribs, punctured lung, ruptured kidney. I died 3 times, 65 units of blood, and then my right leg was amputated. So it was a bit of a mess.
Through more than a dozen operations, he turned to sport to rehabilitate. Now Wheelchair Aussie Rules is part of that journey.
I love wheelchair rugby. I did a wheelchair rugby for the Invictus Games. So anything to do with a wheelchair and a bit of contact, I love it. Always been a big rugby boy, so I mean, for me, anything that gets me back into a bit of like argy-bargy, it's good fun.
Kicking isn't possible, so in Wheelchair Aussie Rules, a handball is a kick and a throw is a handball. But a mark is still a mark, and there are goals and behinds.
We're visitors in this sport. Most of the guys haven't been in a wheelchair before they rock up to this tournament. So then it's about a day and a half of teaching them how to use a wheelchair, how to use an AFL ball in a wheelchair, and just trying to give them skills to actually make us a bit competitive against these guys who live and breathe it every second of their life.
To be able to get back into it, I mean, yeah, it's a different format, a slightly different style. We're in a chair, but it's great. I can't stress how much fun it is.
The Australian Defence Force has 13 players spread across 2 teams at the National Championships, and the RSL is fielding a team as well.
It gives you that sense of mateship, and we'll be playing against the veterans. So you'll have active service guys against veterans, giving each other a good run for the money.
I found out about it last year through a friend who's an amputee within defence, and he was like, look, we're looking for players, will you come along? Hadn't heard of it before that. Thought the opportunity to play footy again with my conditions, I thought we can't pass this up.
The Defence Force teams consist of players who have a range of injuries, some short-term, some long-term. Some of them will have to transition out of the services. The Army captain who's managing the teams views this relatively new game as a vital tool to help his men recover.
It's another way of wounded, injured and ill soldiers coming together, whether they're going to be reintegrated or transition back and still be that living embodiment of those Army values. And it's a great platform. Sport is a great platform for the camaraderie that it builds and the positive mental health that it builds.
It takes away that not being as good as an able-bodied athlete, because you're all equal on court and you're playing as equals against other people instead of trying to run against people with two legs, which just doesn't work.
A lot of rehabilitative sports are generally individual sort of sports, so to be part of a team and have that full team and mateship back behind you is really, really great.
For these men and women, the scoreboard doesn't tell the whole story. No, but it does tell a great story, doesn't it, Bill? It's great to know that our servicemen and women have yet another avenue in which to just recover from injury, but also look forward to their futures.
Absolutely, Neil. For men and women that have been so interested in the sport, it's been so pivotal in their life. This is an excellent way for them to get back on track.
Well, shortly we will be heading to Turkey for the 104th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings.
And then after that, at 1:30, we'll be going to Villers-Bretonneux in France for the dawn service there. Hope you've enjoyed our coverage, our exclusive coverage of the march and the services here today in Adelaide. Thanks for your company.